humanity had forgotten it. For 400 years, no one had been able to cure the Grey River fever. The recipe was lost. Healers threw up their hands and told people to pray. But a young scribe from the most despised class in the world pulled a scrap of parchment from his pocket and told the blacksmith to follow it. How did a beggar orphan know what humanity had forgotten? Let's rewind 3 days. The cold of the stone floor strikes Dan Hay in the back of the head before his vision returns. He opens his eyes and sees the soot-stained vaults of the temple. Not a hospital ceiling, not Boston. A foreign body. Arms too short, fingers thin, a chest as narrow as a child's. Dan tries to sit up, and his muscles shoot with pain as if they haven't been moved in a week. An old man in a gray robe with an open book embroidered on his chest looms over him. He looks at him like a student who failed an exam. He turns to the crowd and utters a single word. Gray. Just a librarian. It's a shame for the guy, but at least they'll feed him. Whispers ripple through the hall. Laughter. Someone mutters that the boy would have been better off not coming to the ritual at all. The librarian class isn't even a class. It's a mockery. Now imagine what's going on in Dan's head. 2 memories collide and refuse to coexist. One is his. 24 years in Boston, University. A dissertation on the scrolls of the Library of Alexandria. Night shifts in the archives. The smell of old paper, which he loved more than any perfume. A truck on the highway. The second memory is fainter and duller. An orphan boy at the temple, 16 years old. Also Dan Hale. Slept in the kitchen, ate the priest's leftovers. Came to the registry ritual to beg for any combat class so he could escape to the guild and never scrub floors again. Got librarian. Collapsed from the flash, and never got up again, because someone else had taken over this body. Dan sits down. His head is spinning. He raises his palms, childlike, calloused from rags. On his wrist, a dull gray mark in the shape of an open book. He doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know why his body has become a stranger's, but he knows the smell. Old paper, parchment, leather bindings. He wouldn't mistake that smell for anything else. Dan turns his head and lets his gaze wander along the walls. Shelves, dozens of them. They stretch into the twilight, overflowing, crooked. Scrolls lie haphazardly. Codices stand spine in. Labels are pinned to the wrong shelves, dust an inch thick, and not a single catalog. And then something shifts inside Dan. Not fear, not panic. He looks at this chaos and thinks one thing: I'm home. The priest loses interest in him and moves on to the next teenager. The hall is full of 16-year-olds. Everyone is praying for the warrior, the fire mage, or even the beastmaster. Anything but the gray mark. Dan stands up. He's unsteady on his feet. His body feels as heavy as an empty backpack. 3 steps and he's gasping for breath. He has just enough stamina to make it up 1 flight of stairs. He slumps against the wall and closes his eyes. His memory settles. From the Boston half, paleography and the systematization of 3 dead languages he read for his dissertation surface. From this side come priests in gray robes and the law of this world. Warriors at the top, librarians at the very bottom. Dan opens his eyes and fixes his gaze on the nearest shelf. A scroll lies askew. The label beneath it is illegible. And this is where the strangest part begins. The symbols on the label shift, not on the shelf, in his head. Foreign symbols click into place like a puzzle and become words. Grain ledger. The 3rd decade of summer. The year 817. He reads it as easily as a sign in English, without translation, without effort. Dan grabs a scroll, unrolls it. Columns of numbers in an unfamiliar script sink into his mind like printed text. Wheat, barley, dates, suppliers' names. He puts it down, picks up the next one. A request for roof repairs. Another one. A donation registry. A list of children admitted to school in the year 304. Each text unfolds before him like a file on a screen. Dan flips through scroll after scroll. His fingers tremble with weakness, but his mind works with frightening clarity. And every scroll he reads is etched into his memory. Not as a vague recollection, as a photograph. He closes his eyes and sees the page, the shelf number, the scroll's location, the neighboring documents. 11 scrolls in 20 minutes. And he remembers every single one down to the last line. This is impossible even by the standards of his earthly memory. It is something else, something connected to the gray mark. The temple empties. The priests extinguish the candles and disperse. Dan stands alone among the shelves, holding a scroll in a language that didn't exist in his past life, and he understands every word. And then he realizes that the gray mark isn't a death sentence. Footsteps behind him. In the aisle, a lean, wiry man of about 50 in a worn cassock. Jorgen, the temple's elder. The man who fed the orphan for 12 years in exchange for scrubbing floors. He mutters that the librarian has no business in the temple, but he won't kick him out. There is work. He leads Dan down worn, slippery steps. The air grows thick. It reeks of dampness and mouse droppings. The basement opens up like a cave. 8 floor-to-ceiling shelves, scrolls mixed in with broken crockery, rat nests, cobwebs like curtains, mold on the bottom shelves. Jorgen waves his hand. Dig through it. If you sort through it, you'll get a full portion. No, you'll go back to the rag. And he leaves. Dan looks at the 8 shelves. In Boston, he once sorted through an archive of 400 boxes in 3 weeks. His colleagues had been searching for a document in it for a month. Dan found it in 40 minutes. It was his only real talent. Finding what you need in the chaos. He pulls out the first scroll, unfolds it, reads it, puts it on the right. The second one, reads it, puts it on the left. The system forms itself in his head. Medicine is separate. Household matters are separate. History in a separate pile. Religion in a separate pile. Anything he didn't understand went into a pile to be reviewed later. He worked late into the night and fell asleep right on the floor among the scrolls. In the morning, he got up and continued. Day 2, Day 3. And on the third day, at the very bottom of the last shelf, beneath dust in the shards of a clay bowl, Dan feels a leather tube. Old. Cracked. With an inscription he reads instantly. But the writing is different. Not temple script. The mountain people's not writing. A system that no one in the valleys has read for 300 years. Dan sees it as clearly as English. A field doctor's journal. The year 412. Dosages for the Gray River fever. He opens the tube. Inside is a scroll in perfect condition. The leather has protected it from the damp. Dan unfolds it and stares intently. 6 prescriptions, exact dosages, instructions for use, names of herbs. He checks against the boy's memory and finds 3 of the 6 right in the temple garden. The rest grow in the surrounding area. Dan copies everything onto a scrap of blank parchment, point by point, and tucks it into his pocket. That same evening, the temple door bursts open. Blacksmith Bran carries in his 8-year-old daughter. Her skin is gray, her breathing is raspy. The heat is so intense that Dan can feel it from 3 paces away. The Gray River fever. Bran shouts that the city healers have refused. They said there is no medicine. They said to wait and pray. The priestesses rush about. The head healer examines the girl and shakes her head. This fever hasn't been treated in 400 years, not since the recipe went missing. Dan reaches into his pocket and pulls out a scrap of parchment. He approaches the young healer who is biting her lip against the wall. A name surfaces from the boy's memory. Sora, the quiet girl who always stays behind the elders. Dan hands her the parchment. Follow these instructions. Do not deviate from the dosages. Sora looks at him, at the parchment, at the elder. The elder snorts that she won't listen to a boy scribe. Bran is kneeling beside his daughter. His hands are shaking. He looks at Dan, at the parchment, and utters a single word. Do it. Sora grabs the parchment. She reads. Her eyes widen. 3 herbs from the list grow in the temple garden. She runs out. She returns 10 minutes later with bunches of greens. She brews a decoction according to the measurements. The elder leaves pointedly. Sora works in silence. Dan stands nearby, making sure she doesn't lose her way. The first decoction, a compress. The second decoction in 2 hours. Dan doesn't sleep all night. Neither does Sora. Bran stands frozen against the wall. By dawn, the girl's breathing evens out. The pallor fades from her skin. The fever subsides. She opens her eyes and asks for water. Bran cries. Silently. He just sits there and cries. Sora freezes with an empty cup and stares at her palms as if seeing them for the first time. An hour later, Bran goes down to the basement where Dan is sorting through the scrolls again. The blacksmith places a knife in front of him. The finest steel he forged to order for the guild. He says he doesn't know what Dan has done, but if Dan needs anything, he'll forge it. Dan looks at the knife, at the shelves around him, at his fingers trembling after 3 sleepless nights. 1 man for 1 scroll. He can do that. The morning after saving the girl, Dan woke up on the basement floor with a headache and aching muscles. His body felt weak. 3 nights without sleep and eating only once a day were taking their toll. He got up and went upstairs. Bran was sitting at the temple entrance. Next to him on a bench, his daughter slept, wrapped in a thick blanket. Her skin color was normal, her breathing was steady. Bran saw Dan and nodded silently. Dan nodded back and went to the kitchen. A surprise awaited him there. A full plate of porridge, a piece of bread, a mug of warm milk. Jorgen stood by the stove and pretended not to notice. But the portion was twice as large as usual. Dan sat down and began to eat. His body needed calories. If he was going to work in this world, he needed to stop staggering from weakness to start with. After breakfast, he returned to the basement. 3 days of work had turned chaos into order. The scrolls lay in 6 piles, sorted by category: medical, domestic, historical, religious, administrative, unidentified. The last pile was the most interesting. 12 scrolls that didn't fit into any category, written in different writing systems, some in standard temple script, some in an archaic dialect, 2 in that very not writing of the mountain people, and 1 in a language Dan had never encountered, neither in his boyhood memories nor in his earthly knowledge. But he read it anyway. The mark on his wrist pulsed faintly as he unrolled the scroll. The text was fragmentary. Part of it had been burned, part of it had been eaten away by moisture. But what remained made Dan freeze. It was a fragment of a list, names, not of people, of creatures. Next to each name was a brief description: size, weaknesses, method of destruction, and a note: speak the name to bind. Dan reread the fragment 3 times. Then he closed his eyes and saw the scroll in his inner library. Every letter in place, every moisture stain. He thought about it for a long time. In the boy's memory, there was something about the Nameless Ones. Creatures that had begun to emerge from the depths of the continent 2 years ago. Creatures that no one could kill, that no bestiary described. And now, right in front of him, lay a fragment of just such a bestiary. An old one, from before the war, from that very time before the burning of the shelves. He placed the scroll in a leather tube and hid the tube on the top shelf behind 2 stacks of household records. No one but him would look there. No one but him would read the contents, even if they found it. Over the next week, life in the temple began to change. Dan completely cleared out the basement. Jorgen went down on the 5th day and stopped in the doorway. 8 bookcases stood in neat rows. The scrolls were sorted by date and subject. A label written in Dan's hand hung on each shelf. The dust had been wiped away. The rat nests were cleaned out. The broken dishes were hauled away. Jorgen stood there in silence. Then he asked how the boy had learned to read and write. Dan replied that he'd taught himself from the scrolls he'd read while washing the floors. Jorgen gave him a long look. He didn't believe him, but he didn't bother to check. He said that from now on, Dan would receive a full portion 3 times a day, and a separate room. A small one, a former storage room next to the basement, but his own. Dan carried a thin mattress and a candle there. He placed 3 scrolls from the unidentified stack on the floor, and for the first time in a week, he slept lying down instead of sitting up. On the 8th day after the ritual, Sora came. She stood in the basement doorway, twisting the end of her sleeve. Dan looked up from the scroll. Sora said she'd come to ask. About that recipe, how he knew the dosages. Dan could have lied, could have said he'd guessed, but he looked at her and saw something familiar. The expression of a person who'd spent their whole life asking the right questions and receiving silence in return. He stood up and took that very field medic's journal off the shelf. He opened it in front of her. Sora looked at the text and said she couldn't read it, nodded writing. Dan nodded. He sat down next to her and began translating aloud, line by line, prescription by prescription. Sora listened without interrupting. Then she began asking questions, smart questions, precise ones, about dosages for children, about substituting one herb for another in case of allergies, about compatibility with temple decoctions. Dan answered the ones he could. He cross-referenced them with his earthly knowledge of pharmacology stored in his memory. He drew parallels. When he didn't know the answer, he said so plainly, "I don't know. I'll have to check." They sat there for 4 hours. When Sora stood up, her eyes were shining. She asked if she could come back again. Dan pulled a second medical scroll from the stack. This one was written in standard temple script. She could read it herself. He handed it to her and said, "Read this. We'll discuss it tomorrow." Sora took the scroll with both hands, as if it were a treasure. She left. The next day, she returned with 3 pages of notes. Dan read the notes and stopped on the 3rd page. Sora had described the symptoms of a disease that Dan recognized from his earthly knowledge. It resembled typhus, but a local variant. And Sora had figured out the mechanism of transmission without knowing the word bacteria. She wrote that the disease was transmitted through water contaminated with dirt from the sick person. 400 years ago, a healer from the tribe knew this. Modern healers did not. Sora had figured it out on her own. Dan looked at her and said, "You have the intuition of that doctor from 412. You're not wrong. They just don't listen to you." Sora was silent. Then she turned away. Then she wiped her face with her sleeve. Dan didn't look. He went back to the scrolls. A minute later, Sora sat down next to him and silently picked up the next document. From that day on, she came every evening. At the same time, other things began to happen. Bran brought his wife to the temple. His wife brought a friend whose husband was sick. Dan found records of similar symptoms in the disorganized archive records of similar symptoms and compiled a list of recommendations. Sora checked the dosages. The friend's husband recovered in 4 days. The friend told her neighbor. The neighbor told people at the market. By the end of the second week, people began coming to the temple. Not for prayers, for help. A woman with a sick child. An old man with a wound that wouldn't heal. A farmer whose livestock was suffering from an unknown illness. Dan didn't treat anyone himself. He searched the archives. He found what he needed. He translated it. He wrote instructions. Sora carried out the medical ones. Bran helped with the household chores. Jorgen grumbled, but didn't get in the way. For the first time in years, the temple was useful to the town. On the 16th day after the ritual, a woman appeared at the temple doors who smelled of earth and herbs. Red hair pulled back into a dirty bun. Freckles all over her face. Her apron was stained with green spots. She was angry. You could tell by the way she stood, hands on her hips, chin jutted forward, eyes narrowed. She said she'd heard about the temple boy who supposedly healed people using old recipes, and that she'd come to see the charlatan because last year she herself had been driven out of the village for the same thing. Dan looked at her. Nothing came to mind. The orphan boy didn't know this woman. Dan asked her name. Ivonne Carter, an herbalist, a former one. He asked why former. Ivonne crossed her arms over her chest and replied that the old witch doctor had accused her of heresy because Yvonne's potions worked better. The village council believed the witch doctor. Ivonne was banished. Since then, she had on the outskirts of town and sold herbs at the market for pennies. Dan nodded. He asked her to sit down. He asked her to show him what she had with her. Yvonne took 3 small bags of dried herbs and a crumpled sheet of paper with recipes written in scrawled handwriting out of her bag. Dan took the sheet. He read it. Then he closed his eyes and began to cross-reference. Plant chemistry. The properties of plants he remembered from his biochemistry course. The components Yvonne used in her recipes. He opened his eyes, looked at her, said, "Yvonne, you've rediscovered 3 compounds that were invented in some distant place. Only 100 years ago. Write everything down. Every recipe, every dosage, every observation. I want to learn from you." Yvonne was silent for a minute, a whole minute. Ivonne Carter swore loudly and often. That was the first fact Dan had learned in their 2 days of working together. The second fact was more important. Yvonne was a genius. Not in the sense that the word was used on Earth. She didn't know theory. She didn't know chemistry. She didn't know the word molecule. But she had spent 10 years in the fields gathering herbs and testing concoctions on herself and her neighbor's goats. Her body was covered in small scars from burns and allergic reactions. She tried everything herself before giving it to others, and her recipes worked. The 3 concoctions Dan had learned about were analogs of Earth medications. An anti-inflammatory, fever reducer, antiseptic for wounds. Yvonne had developed them empirically, no labs, no microscopes, through trial and error. Dan sat at the table and listened as she described the process. She spoke quickly, jumping from one thought to the next. She waved her arms. She cursed the village healer every 3 sentences. Dan took notes, not her words, her recipes. He translated them into a system, dosages in units that could be reproduced, cooking temperatures, steeping times. By the end of the second day, he had a first draft of what he mentally called the Ivonne Carter Pharmacopoeia. 18 recipes, systematized, cross-checked against Earth knowledge and a physician's journal from the year 412. He marked 6 recipes as potentially dangerous. Testing was needed. The remaining 12 were ready for use. He showed the draft to Sora. Sora read for half an hour. Then she looked up and saw Yvonne with new eyes. Ivonne stood by the wall, biting her nail. She was used to people looking at her with contempt. Sora said that 3 recipes from the list solved problems she faced every week. Ivonne stopped biting her nail. On the 20th day after the ritual, what Dan had been anxiously awaiting happened. A messenger from the town of Honeylog, halfway between the temple and the city, brought news. An epidemic. Symptoms similar to that very fever, but not exactly the same. 17 patients, 2 children. The local doctors couldn't cope. Word of the temple boy had reached them there as well. Dan sat in his room and thought. He couldn't go himself. His body wouldn't withstand a day's journey. He wasn't a doctor. He was an archivist in a teenager's body. But he had something else. A system. He called Sora and Ivonne. He laid out 3 scrolls on the table. The physician's journal, records of similar epidemics from the temple archives, and his own notes with cross-references to Earth epidemiology. He explained the symptoms based on the messenger's description. He asked Sora to identify the type of disease. Sora thought for 10 minutes. Then she said it wasn't the Grey River. Something else. It looks like food poisoning, most likely spoiled grain. Dan nodded. This matched his own guess. A fungal infection of the grain. On Earth it was called ergotism. Here it didn't have a name, but the mechanism was the same. He wrote up instructions, 4 pages. First, immediately stop eating grain from current supplies. Second, destroy the contaminated sacks. Third, Yvonne's decoction number 7 to relieve symptoms. Fourth, compresses according to the method from the journal of the year 412. Fifth, boiling water, mandatory. Sixth, isolate severely ill patients from those with mild symptoms. Not because the disease is contagious from person to person, but so that those with mild symptoms don't panic when they see the severely ill. He handed the instructions to Sora. She read them, looked at him, asked why he wasn't going himself. Dan answered honestly, "Because I'll collapse after 2 hours of walking, and you need to be there tomorrow morning." Sora nodded. She grabbed her bag. Ivonne, without a word, gathered the bags of herbs and followed her. Dan stood in the temple doorway and watched them walk down the road. 2 figures. One quiet, with a straight back. The other loud, with a patch of red hair against the gray morning. He stood there thinking about how, for the first time in both of his lives, he had sent other people to do work he couldn't do himself, and about how he needed to learn to trust. He spent 3 days alone. Bran came by in the morning and evening. He brought food. He helped carry the heavy stacks of scrolls. Dan continued working on the archive. Most of it had been sorted through, but that very stack of unidentified scrolls remained. 12 scrolls. He took them one at a time and worked slowly. He wasn't just reading, he was comparing, looking for overlaps. 2 scrolls turned out to be fragments of a single document, scraps of a map. Not a geographical one, a map of the location of something called the Sealed Archives. 13 points on the continent. Next to each point was a note, closed, closed, closed. All 13. Dan unfolded the second fragment and placed it against the first. The map didn't fit together completely. The central part was missing, but 3 points were clearly visible. One in the north, in the mountains, one on the west coast, and one much closer. 2 weeks' journey east of the temple. Next to it, someone had scrawled in small handwriting, "First archive, small collection, voice key." Dan reread the note. Voice key. Not a physical key, not a magical artifact. A word. A word is needed to open the archive. And he was beginning to guess whose word would work. On the 4th day, Sora and Ivonne returned. Tired, dirty, alive. Sora entered the temple and sat down silently on a bench. Ivonne stumbled in after her and announced that all 17 patients would live. 2 children were in the worst condition, but by the morning of the 2nd day they had started eating. The contaminated grain had been destroyed. The wells had been checked. At first, the town elder didn't want to listen to the 2 girls. Then Ivonne told him exactly what she thought of his ability to manage the granary. The mayor turned pale and followed the instructions. Dan listened. Then he asked Sora how she was feeling. Sora was silent. Then she said that this was the first time she had made decisions on her own. Not at the behest of the senior healer. Not according to the registry's canon. On her own. Following instructions written by a boy based on a 400-year-old scroll and recipes invented by an exiled herbalist. And everyone survived. Everyone. Dan nodded. He said he knew it would be like this. Sora asked how he knew. Dan answered, "Because you don't make mistakes. I already told you." The next morning, Dan woke up to the sound of voices. Many voices. He left his room and went upstairs. People were standing in front of the temple. 12 people. From Honey Hollow. They had brought a cart. On the cart were sacks of grain and 4 barrels of salted meat. Payment for their rescue. The village elder had sent a letter. In crooked handwriting on a crumpled sheet, he asked the temple healer to send more prescriptions for the winter. He called Dan a healer, not a librarian. A healer. Jorgen stood in the doorway and looked at the cart with an expression as if he'd been shown a living dragon. The temple hadn't received any donations in 3 years. Dan returned to the basement and sat down at the scrolls. An hour later, Sora came down to him. She was holding a list. She'd compiled it on the road. A list of illnesses encountered in the surrounding towns and villages, according to the people they'd met in Honey Hollow. 14 items. They already had remedies for 3 of them. For the remaining 11, they would have to search. Dan took the list. He read it. He looked at Sora. He said, "Sit down. We'll look." They worked until nightfall. Rumors spread faster than Dan had expected. A month after the ritual, people in 3 nearby towns knew about the temple librarian. They had the wrong idea. Some said a young genius healer lived in the temple. Others said the priests had found an ancient healing artifact. Still others said the city had been blessed by the registry. No one was telling the truth. The truth sounded too boring. A boy reads old scrolls and writes instructions. Who cares about a boy who reads? That worked in Dan's favor. The longer his name remained in the shadows, the longer he could work in peace. But he understood that silence isn't eternal. 5 weeks after the ritual, everything changed. At night, Dan sat in the basement by candlelight, working on a fragment of the bestiary. He was trying to match the description of a creature from the ancient scroll with notes on the nameless ones he'd found in another document. 2 texts, 2 different authors, 2 different centuries. But Dan saw a connection. The creature from the bestiary was described as a being without a fixed form, devouring structures and living flesh, unkillable by steel until named. The notes from the second scroll described an attack on a village 2 years ago. A shapeless creature, devouring houses. 10 A-rank warriors were unable to kill it. 200 dead. The same creature. Or the same species. In the bestiary, next to the description, stood a name. A long word in a language that no longer existed. Dan read it to himself. The mark on his wrist flashed with a gray light. Dim, but distinct. Something stirred inside his throat, as if the word wanted to be spoken. Dan clenched his jaw. Not now. He didn't know what would happen if he said the name out loud. He didn't know the limits. He didn't know the cost. And he wasn't going to experiment without preparation. That had been his principle back on Earth. Every experiment begins with a protocol. He wrote the name on a separate sheet of paper and hid the sheet in a tube along with the bestiary. Then he heard a sound. Upstairs. Quick footsteps. Bran's voice. Loud. Alarmed. Dan climbed the stairs. Bran was standing at the entrance to the temple. Next to him was an unfamiliar man. Young. In torn clothes. Blood on his face. The man spoke quickly and incoherently. He was a messenger from the village of Ashton, 2 days' journey to the southeast. Nameless. The creature emerged from the ground at dawn. Formless. Devouring buildings. 4 dead. The village squad of B-rank warriors couldn't even slow it down. The militia fled. The messenger rode here because he'd heard at the market about a temple where there was someone who knew. Dan listened. His chest grew cold. He knew what kind of creature it was. He had just read about it. He knew its name. And he knew that the name could only be spoken while standing nearby. The bestiary was clear. Speak the name to bind it. The binding radius was not specified. But the logic of the text implied direct line of sight. He couldn't ride to Ashton. It was a 2-day journey on horseback. His body couldn't handle even 4 hours in the saddle. He couldn't send Sora or Ivonne. This wasn't a disease, it was a combat creature. He stood in the temple doorway and felt the wall for the first time, the wall between knowledge and action. He knew how to kill the Nameless One, but he couldn't reach him. Bran was looking at him, waiting. The messenger knelt and begged for help. Dan closed his eyes. He thought. He opened his eyes. He turned to Bran and asked, "Did he know any of the warriors? Hunters? Mercenaries? Someone with a combat class who was currently in town?" Bran thought for a moment and said that a female hunter was camped by the road, a loner, a northerner. She'd arrived 3 days ago, S rank if the mark on her wrist is to be believed, dark arrow class. She's staying at the tavern at the crossroads and isn't bothering anyone, just resting. S rank. Dan blinked. S rank is the highest category in the class system. Warriors of that level worked for the great houses and the capital's guilds.
They didn't stop at roadside taverns in small towns, unless they were running from something, or looking for something. Dan said to Bran, "Take me to her." Bran looked at him doubtfully. The librarian boy is going to hire an S-rank hunter. But he didn't argue. They stepped out of the temple into the pre-dawn chill. Dan walked slowly. His legs were buzzing after 100 steps. Bran walked beside him, matching his pace. The tavern at the crossroads was small and dirty. The owner was asleep behind the bar. Bran knocked on the wood. The owner looked up and said the hunter was upstairs in the 3rd room, and that he didn't recommend waking her up. She'd beaten up 3 guys yesterday who'd tried to hit on her. Dan climbed the stairs. Every step was a struggle. He stopped at the door. He knocked. Silence. He knocked again. The door opened instantly. Dan didn't even see any movement. The door was just closed and then open. A woman stood in the doorway. Tall. A head taller than Dan.
Slim as a whip, short black hair, a scar across her left eyebrow. Her eyes were dark and completely empty. She looked at Dan the way a cat looks at a mouse, without interest, without threat, just noting his presence. A mark glowed on her right wrist. S rank, dark arrow, Dan said. "My name is Dan Hale. I'm the librarian from the temple. I need your help." The woman looked at him for 3 seconds, then she began to close the door. Dan managed to say one more thing. "I know the name of the Nameless One who is currently slaughtering a village 2 days' journey from here, and I know how to kill him." The door stopped. The woman looked at him again. Something flashed in her empty eyes. Not interest, surprise. She asked, "How does a temple boy know the names of creatures that even the imperial bestiary doesn't know?" Dan replied, "Because I read a book that was burned 1,000 years ago." Silence. The woman stepped aside. Dan entered. The room was small. A bed, a table. On the table, 2 short swords. No, not blades. A bow. A disassembled composite bow made of black wood, and a quiver of arrows by the wall. The woman sat down on the bed and folded her arms. She said, "Speak quickly. You have 3 minutes." Dan spoke for 4. He described the creature according to the bestiary: size, behavior, weaknesses. He explained that the creature has no fixed form and absorbs physical matter. Steel and magic do not harm it because it has no body in the usual sense. There is only a name. Uttering the name will bind the creature, force it to take physical form, for a few seconds. In those seconds, it can be killed. But he must be the one to say the name, in person, out loud, while within sight. The woman listened. She didn't interrupt. When Dan finished, she asked one question. Why would he do that? He wasn't a warrior, not a hunter, not a mage. Why would he go to the Nameless One and risk his life for a village he'd never seen? Dan thought. Then he answered, "Because I'm the only one who can read that name. And if I don't go, those people will die." The woman was silent. Then she stood up. She began gathering her bow. She said, "My name is Hedgen Park. I'll take you to the village. If you die on the way, it's not my fault." Dan nodded. He returned to the temple. Sora and Ivonne were standing at the entrance. They already knew from Bran. Sora was silent. Ivonne wasn't. Ivonne said he was crazy, that he had a body like a chicken, that he wouldn't survive the journey, that she wouldn't let him go alone. Dan replied that he wasn't going alone. An S-rank hunter was going with him. Ivonne replied that the hunter didn't know what herbs to give him when he started throwing up from motion sickness in the saddle. She was going with him. Dan looked at Sora. Sora said, "Someone has to stay at the temple. In case the sick come, I'll stay. But you'll come back." It wasn't a request. Dan nodded. Bran led out 2 horses, one of his own, one he'd rented. Dan climbed into the saddle, and his body immediately began to protest. Every step the horse took sent a jolt of pain through his back. Hedgen rode ahead, in silence. Yvonne rode beside Dan and cursed the road, the weather, the horse, and his stubbornness. By the evening of the first day, Dan could no longer sit upright. Yvonne gave him a decoction, bitter as wormwood. The pain subsided. He dozed off in the saddle. Hedgen rode so that his horse would walk steadily, without turning back, but keeping pace. At dawn on the second day, they saw smoke. The smoke rose in a column over Ashton, black, thick, unlike a normal fire. An ordinary fire burns red and yellow. This smoke was gray with a purple tint at the edges. Hedgen stopped her horse on a hill half a league from the village. Dan rode up beside her. His body ached from 2 days in the saddle. Yvonne had given him another decoction that morning, but its effects were wearing off. He looked down at the village and took stock.
Half the houses were still standing. The other half were in ruins, not burned down, devoured. The walls were gnawed away, the roofs had caved in, as if a giant beast had chewed on the buildings and spat them out. Something was moving among the ruins. From this distance, Dan couldn't make out any details, just a mass, dark, fluid, changing shape every few seconds, nameless. Hagen looked at the creature with professional calm. She was assessing it. A minute later, she said, "It's big, larger than she expected from the description. Its radius of absorption is 15 meters. Its movement speed is low. That's good." Dan took a leather tube out of his bag. He pulled out a scroll. He unrolled it. He found the description of the species he was looking for. He read it again. A fourth-order creature, class devourer. Has no fixed form. The core is located at the geometric center of mass. Upon the utterance of the true name, it takes on a physical form. The core becomes vulnerable. The duration of the fixation depends on the speaker's strength. Dan had no idea how strong he was. He had never spoken the true name aloud. He didn't know how many seconds the effect would last. He didn't know what would happen to his body. He knew only what was written in the bestiary. Speak to bind, and that the word in his throat was stirring like a living creature begging to be let out. He explained the plan to Hagen. Simple. Dan approaches within line of sight. He utters the name. The creature freezes. Hagen fires at the core. One shot. Hagen looked at him and asked at what distance he should utter the name. Dan replied that he didn't know. The bestiary didn't specify. But logic suggested that the closer he was, the stronger the effect. Hagen said, "I'll take you within 200 meters. Any closer is impossible. Absorption radius." Dan nodded. 200 meters. He had to hope his voice would carry. They descended the hill. People were standing on the outskirts of the village. Survivors, about 30 people, women, children, old people, a few men with weapons that were useless, swords, spears, axes. Against a formless creature, they were mere sticks. One of the men blocked their path, a sturdy man, bearded, a bandage on his left arm, soaked in blood. He asked who they were and why they had come. Hedgen silently raised her wrist, an S-rank mark. The man stepped back. His face changed. Hope. Desperate, reckless hope. He said the creature had appeared 3 days ago, small at first, the size of a calf, now the size of a house, growing every day. It devours buildings, it devours livestock. Yesterday it devoured 2 people who didn't manage to escape. 2 more died on the first day. A combat squad of 4 B ranks tried to attack. Swords passed right through it. Fire magic vanished inside the mass. Nothing worked. Dan listened and checked against the bestiary in his head. Everything matched. A fourth-order creature, the devourer. It grows by consuming matter. If not stopped, it will keep growing until it devours everything within a radius of several leagues. Then it will move on. He asked the man if there was any high ground with a clear line of sight to the creature. The man pointed to the mill on the eastern edge of the village. The roof was still intact. From there you could see the central square where the creature had settled. Dan looked at the mill. 200 meters from the square, maybe a little more. The roof, a high vantage point, a clear line of sight. He turned to Hedgen. He said, "I need to get on the roof of the mill." Hedgen looked at him, then at the mill, then back at him. She said, "You're not climbing onto the roof. Your arms are like noodles." Dan said nothing because it was true. Hedgen sighed. She said, "I'll lift you up." Yvonne stayed down below with the survivors. She was already laying out her pouches. Among the survivors were the wounded, burns from touching the edge of the mass. Yvonne worked silently and quickly, without swearing, for the first time ever. Hedgen and Dan circled the village. The mill stood off to the side. The creature moved slowly across the central square, devouring what remained of the town hall. Dan could see it clearly, a mass the size of a 2-story house, dark, with flashes of something inside, red, pulsating, the core. Hedgen tossed him onto the roof like a sack, literally. She grabbed him by the waist with one hand and flung him up.
Dan landed on the boards and nearly bit his tongue. He lay there, caught his breath. He sat up. Hedgen jumped up after him, silently. She knelt on one knee, took out her bow, nocked an arrow, black wood, a tip made of some dark metal. She looked at the creature, squinted, said, "I see something red inside, in the center. That's the core." Dan nodded. "That's the core." Hedgen said, "Distance, 220 meters. The arrow will reach it in a second. If the creature freezes for even 3 seconds, I'll hit it." Dan looked at the scroll one last time. The creature's name consisted of 14 syllables, long, heavy. He felt it in his throat, like a hot stone, a living word ready to burst forth. He looked at Hedgen. He said, "I don't know what will happen to me afterward." Hedgen didn't answer. She was looking at the creature through the bow's sight, finger on the string, back straight, breathing steady. She didn't care what would happen to him. She did care whether she would hit her mark. Dan turned toward the creature, opened his mouth, and uttered the name. The sound came out of his throat not as a word, like the toll of a bell. 14 syllables, one after another. Each syllable burned his throat. On the 3rd syllable, a taste of blood appeared in his mouth. On the 7th, his throat cramped. On the 10th, he nearly choked. But he continued. He rasped out the last 4 syllables barely audibly. But it was enough. The creature froze. The flowing mass stopped, like water turned to ice. The surface hardened. The core inside flashed scarlet. It became visible, clear, like a ruby in glass. The bowstring snapped. Dan didn't even see the arrow. He just heard the snap and a second later saw the core explode. A flash of red, then white, then nothing. The creature crumbled, not into ash, not into fragments. It just vanished. The mass dissolved into the air like fog in the sun. A half-meter deep dent remained in the ground in the square. And silence. Absolute silence. Dan lay on the roof and stared at the sky. His mouth was full of blood. His throat burned. Every breath brought pain. The mark on his wrist throbbed so hard it glowed through his sleeve. He turned his head. Hedgen stood with her bow lowered, staring at the spot where the creature had been a second ago. Then she looked at Dan, at the blood on his lips, at his hands clenched around the roof boards. Her expression didn't change. But she did something Dan hadn't expected. She took a flask from her belt and silently handed it to him. Dan took it. He rinsed his mouth, spit out the blood, took a few sips. The water was cold and clear. He lay there and thought about what had just happened. He had spoken the true name. The creature froze. Hedgen had killed it. With a single arrow. It had taken less than 10 seconds from the name to death. His body had paid the price. His throat was torn from the inside. Every breath felt like a mouthful of broken glass. He did the math. 1 name, 14 syllables. The result? His throat was out of commission for at least a day. Blood in his mouth, dizziness. If he had tried to say the second name right after, he would most likely have lost consciousness. That was the limit. Harsh, real. He couldn't throw names around. Every utterance cost him dearly. Hedgen helped him down from the roof. She practically carried him down in her arms like a child. She set him on the ground. He stood there, staggering. Ivonne ran out from around the corner of the mill. She saw the blood on his face and started cursing. Then she fell silent. She took a vial of something green out of her bag. She made him drink it. It burned his throat, and then the pain began to recede, slowly. But it receded. People were running out of the village. A bearded man, women, children. They had seen it, from the outskirts. They saw the creature freeze and crumble. They saw the arrow. They heard the sound. That sound. The name. The bearded man approached and stopped in front of Dan. He looked at the skinny boy with blood on his chin, at the gray mark on his wrist, at the hunter standing behind him with a bow. The man slowly dropped to one knee, then a second, a third. Within a minute, all 30 survivors were on their knees. Dan wanted to tell them to stand up, but his throat wouldn't obey. He stood there watching the people kneeling before the boy with the trash class mark. Hedgen stood behind him, silent. Ivonne stood beside him, silent for the first time in her life. They spent the night in a surviving house on the outskirts. Dan couldn't speak until morning. Ivonne tended to the wounded. Hedgen went to scout the surroundings. She returned 2 hours later and said there were no other creatures. Dan lay on a stranger's bed and leafed through the bestiary in his head. He now knew 3 things. First, true names work. A creature can be bound and killed. Second, the price is high. One name takes him out of commission for a day. 2 names in a row will likely kill him. Third, he needs another way. He won't be able to say the names himself every time. He needs an amplifier, or an intermediary, or both. In the morning, Hejin came to him and sat on the edge of the bed. Dan was able to sit up but spoke with difficulty, hoarsely, quietly, every word like sandpaper. Hejin said, "She's been hunting for 6 years. She's killed 14 S-rank creatures.
She'd gone on 2 raids with Imperial troops, and she'd never seen anything like this. Never heard of anyone saying a name and the creature stopping. She asked, "Where did he get this scroll?" Dan answered, "From the temple basement, from a pile of trash." Hejin was silent. Then she said, she had no business, no contracts, no home. She was heading south because in the north there were no more creatures left that could be killed the usual way. Her clan had fallen apart. Her partner had been killed by the Nameless One 6 months ago. She hadn't been able to save him because she didn't know how to kill a creature without a name. She'd stopped at the tavern because she'd been thinking of leaving the trade. Because what's the point of hunting something you can't kill? And then a boy with a gray mark came along and said he knew the name. And the name worked. She said, "I'm staying." Dan looked at her. He asked hoarsely why. Hejin replied, "Because this boy has the most interesting mind she's ever seen, and because with him, she can do her job again." Dan nodded. 2 days later, they rode back to the temple. Dan rode in the saddle and said nothing. His throat was healing slowly. Ivonne gave him herbal teas every 4 hours. Hejin rode ahead, not so far now, closer, within earshot. At a distance from which they could react in time if something went wrong. They returned to the temple on the 3rd day. Sora came out to meet them. She looked at Dan. At the blood on his shirt. At his throat, wrapped in a cloth soaked in Yvonne's herbal tea. She didn't say a word. She simply took his hand and led him into a room. She laid him down, changed the compress. Dan lay there, staring at the ceiling. 4 people, a blacksmith, a healer, an herbalist, a hunter. A month ago, he had been alone, a temple orphan in a trash bin classroom. Now he had a team, a small one, strange, but a team. Hejin settled on the temple roof. Without explanation, she just climbed up and lay down. Yvonne asked why. Hejin answered, so she'd be the first to hear strangers' footsteps. Yvonne looked at her, then at the temple, then at the roof, and for the first time ever, she said nothing. Her throat healed in 4 days, not completely. Her voice remained hoarse and quiet, like that of someone who had been screaming in the cold for a long time. Sora changed her compresses morning and night. Yvonne prepared a decoction of 3 herbs that reduced the inflammation from within. Dan lay there and thought. He thought about what had happened in Ashton, about the price of a name, about the fact that he couldn't be a single-use weapon. 1 name in a day without a voice. 2 names in a row and probable death. This isn't a system, it's a death sentence. If dozens of names, and he can only say 1 name a day, the math is simple. He won't make it in time. He needs another way. On the 5th day, he called for Bran. The blacksmith came immediately. He sat on the floor next to Dan's bed and listened. Dan spoke slowly. Every word came with effort. He described his idea to Bran. In the bestiary, he found a mention of the object, a resonator, a device that the ancient librarians used to amplify the voice, not in terms of volume, in terms of power. The resonator took the spoken name and held it in the air longer than a human voice could sustain it. Instead of a 3-second freeze, one could get 8 or 10, and the strain on the throat was distributed between the speaker and the device. The problem was that the description of the resonator in the bestiary was incomplete. The material was mentioned, metal imbued with a specific sound frequency. The shape was mentioned, a hollow cylinder with internal partitions, but there were no exact dimensions. Dan recalled something from earth physics, acoustics, resonance frequencies, hollow tubes and standing waves. He wasn't an engineer, but he was a graduate student who had lived at the university for 4 years and attended lectures in related disciplines simply because he was interested. First-year physics, materials science, a seminar on the acoustics of medieval cathedrals that he stumbled into by accident and sat through until the end. All of this lay on the shelves of his memory. He closed his eyes. He opened his internal library. He found his notes on acoustics. He flipped to the section on resonance tubes. He compared it with the description from the bestiary. 2 sources, earth physics and ancient magic. Between them lay a third kind of knowledge. Dan opened his eyes and began dictating the dimensions to Bran. The length of the tube, the diameter, the wall thickness.
The arrangement of the internal partitions. The material. Bran listened and sketched with a charcoal stick on the board. When Dan finished, Bran looked at the drawing and said it looked like a flute. Dan replied that it was a flute. Only instead of music, it would play names. Bran went into the smithy. He returned 3 days later with the first prototype, a hollow steel cylinder, an elbow's length long, with 4 partitions inside. Rough, unpolished, but precise in its dimensions. Dan took it in his hands and felt the mark on his wrist twitch. Faintly, barely perceptibly, but it twitched. He brought the cylinder to his lips and uttered a single word. Not a name, just a word in the language of the ancients that meant light. The cylinder hummed. A low sound traveled through the metal and emerged from the other end, amplified and altered. The candle on the table flared brighter for a moment. Then it went out. His throat didn't hurt, not at all. Dan set the cylinder on the table and sat down. His hands were shaking. Not from pain, from realization. It worked. He needed to refine the design. He needed different materials. He needed to fine-tune the partitions. But the principle worked. The next 2 weeks turned into a series of experiments. Dan and Bran made 7 versions of the resonator, each one better than the last. Dan tested them by uttering simple words in the ancient language. Not the names of creatures, the names of objects. Fire, water, stone, iron. Each word produced a faint effect through the resonator. A candle flared, the water in the cup rippled. The stone on the table shifted slightly. The iron nail trembled. The effects were negligible, but his throat didn't hurt. Not at all. The resonator took the strain. With the 8th version, Dan achieved stability. A cylinder made of lightweight steel, 4 partitions, a leather-wrapped mouthpiece so it wouldn't burn his lips, a cord to hang it around his neck. Bran polished it and engraved the symbol of an open book on the side. Not because Dan asked, of his own volition. While Dan worked on the resonator, the rest of life on the station didn't stop. He stopped calling the temple a temple. In his mind, the place had become the station. A place where people work. A place where they help. A place where knowledge turns into action. Sora ran the infirmary. 3 beds in the former refectory. Patients came every day. Minor ailments, cuts, burns, colds. Sora managed on her own. For complicated cases, she consulted with Dan. He'd find the right scroll in his head in a minute. He'd give her a reference. Sora would check it and act. Ivonne had laid out a medicinal herb garden behind the temple. Small but well organized. Every bed was labeled. Every plant was tagged with its name and properties. Dan had compiled a catalog of 32 herbs for her. Earthly knowledge of botany overlaid on the local flora. Ivonne complained that the catalog was too detailed. Then she complained that it wasn't detailed enough. Then she silently added her observations in the margins. Hagen patrolled the surroundings. Every day she left at dawn and returned in the evening. She checked the road. She checked the forest. She checked the approaches to the temple. In the 3rd week after Ashton, she returned earlier than usual. She entered silently. Silently, she placed a leather pouch on the table in front of Dan. Dan opened it. Inside was a badge, bronze, engraved. An open book crossed out with a cross. Hagen said, "Found it on a corpse, in the woods. 2 hours walk away." The body was fresh, 2 days at most. A man, middle-aged, armed with a short sword and a crossbow. He was wearing a uniform that Hagen didn't recognize, gray, no insignia except for this badge. Dan looked at the symbol. An open book crossed out with a cross. Nothing came to mind from his boyhood memories, but Dan made the connection. An open book is the symbol of the librarians, a cross over it, a crossed-out book. Someone is wearing the symbol of book destruction as an emblem. He asked Hagen what this man had died from. Hagen replied, "A snake bite. An accidental death, not a fight." But the man was heading in a certain direction, toward the temple. Dan placed the plaque on the table and stared at it for a long time. Then he delved into his memory, into the part that held the ancient bestiary and fragments of the map. Next to them lay 2 more scrolls from the unidentified stack. He had read one of them during the 2nd week and set it aside. Now he returned to it. The scroll described an organization without a name. People in gray robes. People who, after the burning of Pollock 1,000 years ago, had taken on the role of oversight. To ensure that the librarians never returned to power. To ensure that ancient knowledge remained forgotten. To destroy any librarian class individual who began to display true abilities. The scroll was not written by an enemy of this organization. It was written by one of its members. It was an internal document. Instructions for new recruits. It described how to find a librarian,
How to determine that his abilities had been activated, how to eliminate them quietly, and how, after elimination, to wipe out any traces of their work. Burn the scrolls, destroy the records, kill witnesses if necessary. Dan closed the scroll and placed it in the tube. His hands were steady. Inside there was no calm. In 10 years, 40 out of 42 librarians had died. Accidental deaths, accidents, attacks by bandits. No one connected them because who cares about the death of a lowly class? Now Dan knew these weren't accidents. It was a system, and that system knew about him. The dead man in the forest was heading toward the temple. A snake killed him, but the next one won't kill him. He called for Hale. He showed her the scroll. Hale couldn't read it, but Dan translated the key points. Hale listened in silence. When he finished, she said one word. When. Not if. When. When the next ones come. Dan replied, soon. Rumors about Ashton are already spreading. One of the survivors will tell of the boy who spoke the name. The story will reach the capital in a month. It will reach this organization sooner. Hale nodded. She stood up. She left. An hour later, she returned with a drawing. She had sketched a diagram of the temple's defenses, observation points, retreat routes, weak spots in the walls, places for ambushes. Dan looked at the diagram and thought that this woman thinks like a military commander, not a hunter. He asked how many people were needed to defend the temple. Hale answered. With her alone, it would be enough against 5, not against 10. Dan nodded. He needed more people. And he needed to leave the temple, not to run away, to avoid putting Jorgen and the other priests in danger. The temple was home to 20 people. If the librarians' killers came, they wouldn't stop at the priests. He sat in his room and stared at the wall. On the wall hung a map he had drawn from fragments in the basement archive. The road ran past the temple eastward toward the coast. There were 3 post stations along the road. One was operational, one was abandoned, one completely abandoned. The abandoned station was 4 hours' journey away. A stone building, a stable, a well. Walls thick enough to withstand an arrow. 2 stories, a basement. He stood up and went to see Hale. The journey took 3 days. Bran brought a cart. Hale had scouted the road and the station itself in advance. A 2-story stone building. The roof had caved in places, but the walls were intact, thick, made of river stone. A stable with 4 stalls, a well with clean water. The basement was dry with stone vaults, perfect for storing scrolls. Dan stood in front of the building and didn't see ruins. He saw a library. The first day was spent clearing out the place. Bran and Hale hauled out the trash, old furniture, rotten hay from the stable, rat nests from the basement. Ivonne explored the surroundings and found 3 sources of medicinal herbs within an hour's walk. Sora inspected the rooms and decided which one would become the infirmary. A room on the first floor with a south-facing window, lots of light, fresh air. Dan went down to the basement and began setting up the shelves. Bran had whacked them together from planks in 2 days. Simple, sturdy, even. Dan arranged them according to a system he knew by heart, the decimal classification, adapted to local conditions. Medicine on the first shelf, botany and herbs on the second, bestiary and military affairs on the third, history and geography on the fourth, household records on the fifth, unfinished research on the sixth. Every shelf is labeled, every scroll is its place. He had brought all the scrolls from the temple that Jorgen had allowed him to take. The headman had given him everything except the temple registers. It was more than Dan had expected. 142 scrolls, 23 codices, 6 tablets, a trifle by the standards of a real library, but a start. Yvonne brought her notes, all of them, 3 years of work, recipes, observations, failed experiments. Dan copied them out neatly and arranged them on the shelves next to the medical scrolls. A name was written on the spine of each notebook, Ivonne Carter. She stood there looking at her notes on the shelf next to the works of ancient physicians. She didn't curse. She didn't argue. She just stood there and looked. On the 4th day, the first visitor arrived at the station, a farmer from the road. His goats were sick. Their fur was falling out in clumps. The local healer didn't know what to do. The farmer had heard from the blacksmith that there was a boy at the temple who knew the old recipes. He came to the temple. Jorgen sent him to the station. Dan listened to the description of the symptoms. He closed his eyes. He opened his inner library. He found records of domestic animal diseases from the agricultural scroll. He compared them with Earth veterinary medicine. Parasitic infection,
ticks or something similar. He wrote up instructions. Wash the fur with a decoction of 2 herbs. Isolate the sick from the healthy. Treat the pen. Repeat in a week. Ivonne gathered the herbs from her supplies. The farmer left. He returned 10 days later. The goats were healthy. He brought a barrel of milk and a wheel of cheese as a thank you. During their first month at the station, 37 people came to see them. With illnesses, with questions about the harvest, with requests to decipher an old letter found in a basement or attic. One merchant brought a plaque he'd found in the ruins and couldn't read. Dan read it. It was an IOU for an amount that, 300 years ago, was worth the price of a house. The merchant laughed and said that now he knew whom to hold accountable, his great-great-grandfather. But every visitor was a risk. Every visitor was a mouth that would spread the word. Dan understood this and accepted it. The alternative was worse. Closing down meant stopping helping. And if he stopped helping, why was he here? In the 6th week after the move, Hale returned from patrol earlier than usual. She entered quietly. That in itself was a sign. When Hale entered quietly, it meant she was carrying bad news. She sat down across from Dan and said, 3, on the road, halfway west. Armed. 2 swords, 1 crossbow. Gray clothing. No insignia. Heading toward the station. Not in a hurry. Dan put down his pen. He looked at Hale. He asked, "Class?" Hale replied, 1 B rank, 2 C ranks, mid-level. No problem for her. But the problem is something else. If she kills them, new ones will come. And they'll know there's an S rank here. They'll come specifically for the S rank, Dan thought. Then he said, "Don't kill them. Let them come." Hale raised an eyebrow. It was the most expressive movement Dan had seen on her face in the 2 months they'd known each other. He explained, "If the first group returns alive and reports that a weak boy, the librarian, and 3 women, then the second group will be small. If the first group doesn't return, the second will come as an army." Hale looked at him. Then she nodded. She said, "Smart, but dangerous." "If those 3 try to kill him right here," Dan replied, "you'll be on the roof. Yvonne will be in the garden. Sora will be in the infirmary. If they try, they won't have time." Hale replied, "If they try, one of them will die before the second one draws his sword." She wasn't joking. The mercenaries arrived the next day. 3 men, gray clothes with no insignia, short swords under their cloaks. One had a crossbow in a case on his back. They entered the station as travelers. They asked for water. Dan went out to meet them. A skinny boy in glasses that Bran had made according to his description. Simple glass lenses in an iron frame. The body's eyesight was poor, and Dan had needed them for a long time. He looked like what they considered him, a harmless, bookish boy. One of the mercenaries asked if the librarian they talk about on the road lived here. Dan replied that he did. He is the librarian. He helps people with recipes and old records. The mercenary smiled. He asked if it was true that Dan read ancient scrolls. Dan said that he did. Mostly medical and household stuff. Boring stuff. The mercenary nodded. He smiled. His right hand rested on his thigh, 10 centimeters from the hilt of his sword under his cloak. Dan saw that. And he saw something else. There was a rune on the mercenary's left forearm. A combat rune of enhancement. But it was upside down. Dan looked at the rune and said, "Excuse me, but the rune on your arm guard is upside down. Is that on purpose, or did the craftsman make a mistake? Because if it's upside down, your enhancement spells only work half the time." The mercenary stopped smiling. His face went pale. Dan continued, "Judging by the wear on the leather, you've been wearing this gauntlet for a long time, at least a year. That means your combat skills have been operating at half strength for a year. Any competent armorer would have noticed this, but apparently you got an incompetent one. I can draw the correct orientation if you'd like." Silence. The second mercenary looked at the first. The third looked at Dan. No one moved. Then the first mercenary slowly took his hand off his hip. Slowly. Very slowly. He said they were just passing through. That it was time for them to go. That thanks for the water. They turned and left, quickly, without looking back. Hale came down from the roof 5 minutes later. She said, "They went west, at a brisk pace." Dan sat on the bench by the entrance and looked out onto the road. His hands weren't shaking. He didn't feel fear. He felt something worse. Realization. They'll be back. Not these 3. Others. Better prepared. More dangerous. And they wouldn't be coming for information. They'd be coming for him. After the mercenary's visit, Dan changed his routine. The morning began with Hedgen's report. She'd leave at dawn and check the road in both directions for 3 hours. She'd return and report. Who had passed through? Who had walked by? Were there any signs of a camp? Was there anything unusual? Dan took notes. He kept a log. After 2 weeks, he had a map of regular traffic along the road. He knew when the trade caravans passed through. He knew the schedule of the postal couriers. He knew on which days farmers from the surrounding villages went to market. Anyone who deviated from this pattern stood out. At the same time, he worked with the archives. 142 scrolls had been sorted and cataloged, but that wasn't enough. It was catastrophically insufficient. To fight the Nameless Ones, he needed a complete bestiary. The fragment he found in the basement contained descriptions of 4 creatures, 4 names, and according to rumors, there were dozens of Nameless Ones, maybe hundreds. The first sealed archive. He thought about it every day. A 2-week journey to the east, a voice key, tens of thousands of scrolls inside, everything he needed lay there. But he couldn't leave, not now. The station had only just begun operating. People came to him every day. Sora couldn't handle the infirmary on her own. Yvonne needed his help cataloging herbs. Bran was working on the second resonator, a backup, in case the first one broke. Leaving now meant abandoning everything he had built. And there was one more reason. He wasn't sure he could open the archive. The voice key required saying something, but what? A name, a word, a phrase. The bestiary offered no answer. The map fragments offered no answer. He needed other sources.
And one of them came on its own. In the 8th week after moving to the station, Mercy Holloway appeared. She arrived on a mule, alone, a small girl in the cataloger's gray robe, glasses with thick lenses, an ink stain on her right cheek, a bag stuffed with parchment. She introduced herself as an inspector from the Catalogers Guild, sent to investigate rumors of the illegal storage and use of ancient texts. Dan looked at her and saw 3 things. First, she was scared. Her hands were shaking. Her voice was steady, but her fingers gave her away. Second, her robe was old and patched in 3 places. Junior inspector, the lowest rank. The person sent on assignments that none of the senior officers want to take. Third, in her bag, besides parchment, there were scrolls, not official, personal. The edges were frayed from being unfolded so many times. She carried her work with her. Dan invited her inside, showed her the basement, the shelves, the catalog, the labeling system.
Mercy walked along the shelves and said nothing. Then she stopped. Then she went back to the beginning, walked through it again, more slowly. She touched the labels on the shelves, read the markings. She opened the scrolls and checked the correspondence. An hour later, she turned to Dan and said that this was the best cataloging system she had ever seen. Better than in the Guild's capital archive. Better than in the Imperial Library where she had once been allowed on a tour. Then she asked who had taught him. Dan replied, "No one. I developed it myself, based on principles I've known for a long time." Mercy looked at him, her nearsighted eyes behind thick lenses. She didn't believe him, and yet she did believe him, because the proof stood all around her on 6 shelves. Dan asked, "What's in the bag?" Mercy hesitated. Then she took out the scrolls, 4 of them, maps. Not geographical maps of the area, route maps, trade routes, trails through the mountains, river crossings, detailed, precise, with notes in the margins. Dan unfolded the first map and began reading the notes. They were small, neat, written by the hand of a person who was used to no one being able to make out his handwriting. Because these weren't official notes, these were Mercy's ideas. She had noticed that 3 trade routes intersected at a point that no official map recorded. She had surmised that a city had once stood there, or a fortress, or something else. She had plotted the coordinates, calculated the distances, cross-referenced them with historical records, and concluded that this point coincided with one of the unpublished archives. Dan read her notes and felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. She had found the archive, not the one he knew, another one, the 4th, in the northwest. And she hadn't found it through force or magic. She had found it through cartography, logic, analysis of trade routes. Because if a city existed, roads led to it. And if a city vanished, the roads still curved around the empty space out of centuries-old habit. Dan laid the map on the table. He looked at Mercy. He said, "Mercy, these maps are yours. Not the mentors, not the guilds. Yours. Write your name."
Mercy stood motionless. Then she slowly picked up the quill from the table, dipped it in ink, and wrote in the lower corner of the map, Mercy Holloway. Her hand trembled. The letters came out crooked. She looked at her signature, and tears streamed down her cheeks. Quiet. Soundless. The ink stain on her right cheek smudged from the moisture. Dan didn't look. He went back to the scrolls. A minute later, Mercy sat down next to him and began to work. From that day on, she stayed. She sent the report to the guild a week later. She wrote that the station held administrative and medical records of no interest to the Church of the Registry, that the librarian was engaged in minor assistance to farmers and was not violating any laws,
that the inspection was complete, that she was staying on site for further observation. The last point was a formality. She didn't stay for observation. She stayed because, for the first time in her life, someone had seen her work. For the next 3 weeks, Dan and Mercy worked together. She was quick, precise. Her memory wasn't like Dan's. She didn't see pages with photographic accuracy, but she remembered maps. Any map she'd seen even once, she could reproduce by hand with precision down to the smallest details. Spatial memory. Dan remembered text. Mercy remembered space. Together, they covered 2/3 of what was needed to work with the archive. He showed her fragments of the map of the sealed archives. Mercy spread them out next to her own maps. She superimposed one on top of the other. The matches became apparent within 10 minutes. 3 points from the bestiary and 1 point from Mercy. 4 archives. The locations were cross-verified. Mercy looked up at Dan. Her eyes behind the thick lenses were enormous. She said, "It's real." The sealed archives are real, not a legend, not a myth. They exist. Dan nodded. They exist. And I need to open one of them. 3 months after the ritual, life at the station had settled into a rhythm. In the morning, Hagen would go out on patrol. Sora saw patients. Ivonne worked in the garden, and in the lab they'd set up in the old stable. Mercy sat in the basement with maps. Brand came from town 3 times a week. He brought supplies. He took away orders. He fixed whatever broke. Dan coordinated everyone. He read, he searched, he compared, he wrote instructions, he answered visitors' questions. People came to the station, not in crowds, 2 or 3 people a day, but they came. Farmers, artisans, small traders. Once a wandering monk came and asked permission to copy 2 scrolls on agronomy. Dan allowed it. The monk sat for 2 days copying and then left. A month later, Dan learned that the monk had retold the contents of the scrolls in 3 villages to the north. The harvest in those villages increased by 1/3. That was what Dan wanted. Knowledge was spreading, slowly, drop by drop. But it was spreading. However, the peace ended in the 11th week. Hagen returned from her morning patrol and brought a person with her. A woman, tall, dark hair, a black cloak. 2 short blades at her belt. Her hands were bound behind her back with a rope. Her face was battered. Hagen had caught her in the woods an hour's walk from the station. The woman had been following them for at least 3 days. Hagen noticed the tracks on the 2nd day and went out to intercept her on the 3rd. The fight didn't last long. Hagen was S rank. The woman was A rank. A difference of 1 category, but in a fight between professionals, that's enough. The woman sat on the floor in the basement and said nothing. Dan stood across from her and looked at her. Gray clothes under a black cloak, short blades of special forging, a crossbow behind her back that was no longer there because Hagen had taken it, and a badge in her pocket. An open book crossed out with an X. The order. Dan sat down on the floor across from her. His body protested. The stone floor was cold. But he needed to be on the same level as her, not above, not below, beside. He asked her name. Silence. He asked again. The woman raised her head, dark eyes, empty, like Hagen's when they first met, only a different kind of emptiness. Hagen had the emptiness of a professional. This woman had the emptiness of someone who had stopped feeling. She spoke. Raven song. Dan nodded. He asked why she had come. Raven replied briefly. To kill him. Silence in the basement. Yvonne stood by the door, clenching her fists. Mercy turned pale. Sora stood motionless behind Dan. Hagen stood in the corner, her hand on her bow. Dan looked at Raven. Then he asked, "Why didn't you kill him?" 3 days of watching. He went out into the yard every morning. He stood alone, without guards. 3 chances. Raven was silent for a long time. Then she said, on the 2nd evening, she saw through the window how he was sitting by candlelight with a boy. A 10-year-old son of a farmer from a neighboring village. The boy came to the station every 3 days. Dan taught him to read. Not scrolls, not ancient texts, just ordinary letters. The boy was from a poor family. No one had ever taught him. Dan sat with him and traced the letters with his finger. Patiently. Slowly. Repeating as many times as necessary. That evening, Dan was teaching him the names of the stars. He pointed out the window at the sky. He named a star. The boy repeated it. Dan corrected him. The boy repeated it again. Raven watched from the darkness and couldn't bring herself to raise the crossbow. She fell silent. Dan waited. Then he said, "Tell me everything you know about the Order." Raven looked up at him. Something flashed in her empty eyes. Confusion. She asked, "Why? Why isn't he kicking her out, interrogating her, threatening her? She came to kill him. She's the enemy." Dan replied, "I believe you." Raven then looked at him. No one, ever, had ever said those words to her. Since childhood, she had been raised as a tool. The Order took her in at 4 years old. They trained her, taught her to kill. They explained that librarians were heresy, that ancient knowledge was dangerous, that the world must be cleansed of those who read the forbidden. She had killed 6 librarians over the past 3 years. 6. 3 men, 2 women, 1 teenager. Every time she was told she was cleansing the world. Every time she believed it. Because that's how she was taught. Because she didn't know any different. And then she spent 3 days watching through the window as a boy taught a child to read the stars. And she realized she couldn't do it. Dan listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. When she finished, he said, "I need everything you know. The Order's structure, names, bases, methods, roots." Raven said she'd tell him, but she had a condition. Dan asked what it was. Raven said, "Don't let me go." If she left, the Order would find her and kill her for treason. Here, she had a chance. Dan nodded. He turned to Hale. "Untie her," she said. Hale didn't move. She was looking at Raven with an expression Dan couldn't read. Then she walked over and cut the rope with a knife. Raven rubbed her wrists. She looked at Dan, then at the others, at Sora, who stood silently, at Ivonne, who was clenching her fists, at Mercy, who had gone pale, at Hale, who stood with a knife in her hand and didn't put it away. Raven said, "The Order of the Pure Registry, founded 2 years after the burning of Polak. Function: the destruction of Librarian Class carriers and related materials. Structure: 3 circles. Outer: mercenaries and informants."
The 3 who came on reconnaissance were from the outer circle. Middle: agents. Trained assassins like her. 22 people, according to the latest data. Inner circle: leadership. She didn't know how many. She hadn't seen their faces. She received orders through dead drops. But she knew one name: Lord Inquisitor, head of the Order. A man even the mid-level agents feared. A man who personally interrogated every captured librarian before their execution. Name: Haywood Kane. Dan wrote it down. The name fell onto the page like a sentence. But whose? Raven continued. The Order knew about Dan. From Ashton. Messengers from the village had told of a boy who had spoken the name. The information reached the Order 3 weeks ago. The first group came to scout. They left, she reported. Raven was sent as the second wave, a quiet assassination. If she didn't return within 2 weeks, the third wave would be a combat team of 6 mid-tier agents. Dan calculated. Raven had been here 5 days.
Plus 3 days of surveillance. 8 days. They had 6 days left before the Order realized Raven hadn't returned. Then another week to assemble the group. Then 2 weeks of travel. A month. They had a month. Dan looked at Raven, then at Hale, then at the map on the wall. The first sealed archive. 2 weeks' journey to the east, a month before the Order's combat team arrives. If he left now, he'd reach the archive and return just in time. If the archive opens, if what he needs is inside, if he even survives the journey. Dan stood up. He looked at everyone. He said, "We're going to the first archive, not all of us. Hale and Raven are coming with me. Sora stays at the station. Ivonne stays. Mercy stays. Bran defends the station." Ivonne immediately objected that he was leaving her behind again. Dan replied, "Ivonne, if the station falls, everything we've built will be lost. I need someone I trust to make sure that doesn't happen." Ivonne fell silent. Then she muttered that he was sucking up again. Then she nodded. Mercy raised her hand. She said she had a map of the route to the first archive. She had calculated it based on the intersections of trade routes and old road descriptions. 14 days' journey, but if they went through the Grey Bones Pass, it would be 10. Hagen said she knew the pass. Passable. Dangerous, but passable. Dan looked at Raven. He asked, "You'll go?" Raven replied, "You have no choice. You don't know what the Order's traps look like. I do. There will be traps on the way to the archives." Dan nodded. They were setting out tomorrow at dawn. The Grey Bones Pass got its name not from the color of the stones. The stones there were black. The bones were real. Old. Whitened by time. They lay along the path like road markers, human and otherwise. Hagen led the way. Raven brought up the rear. Dan walked between them and tried not to fall behind. His body was stronger than it had been 3 months ago.
Regular meals and Yvonne's herbal teas had done their job. He could walk for 4 hours straight before he started to get winded. 3 months ago, it had been 2 hours. Progress. Slow, but progress. On the third day of the journey, Hagen stopped. She raised her hand. Dan froze. Raven silently shifted to the side and vanished into the shadows of the boulders. Hagen stood motionless. Then she slowly crouched and pointed to the path. Dan approached. A thin thread stretched across the path at ankle height, transparent, almost invisible, tied to a mechanism in the rock. Raven stepped out of the shadows and crouched down beside her. She looked. She spoke. The Order. A standard trap of the outer circle. A tension wire. If it snaps, a crossbow bolt fires from a crevice in the rock. Poisoned. The poison takes effect in 3 minutes. There is no antidote. She disarmed the trap in 30 seconds, found the crossbow in the rock, removed the bolt, showed Dan the greenish coating on the tip.
Dan looked at the bolt, closed his eyes. He opened the internal library, found Yvonne's notes on poisons, found a description of the greenish coating, cross-referenced it with earth toxicology. An alkaloid, a plant-based neurotoxin. It paralyzes the respiratory muscles. 3 minutes until death, that's for sure. He asked Raven how many traps the Order usually sets on the approaches to guarded sites. Raven answered, "It depends on the importance. On a standard route, 3 or 4. On the approaches to the sealed archive, she didn't know. She'd never been assigned such tasks. But if the archive really exists, the traps weren't set yesterday. They've been set for hundreds of years. Updated, checked, new ones, maybe dozens." Dan nodded. Dozens of traps for a 10-day journey. The math wasn't encouraging. They continued on their way. Raven was now walking in front. Hagen moved to the middle. Raven found the traps. Over the next 4 days, she discovered and disarmed 11. Trapping wires. Pits with stakes camouflaged by branches. Rocks on ropes ready to come crashing down. One steel trap with serrated teeth. Raven worked silently and methodically. She dismantled every trap and explained its mechanism to Dan. Not because he asked, because that was how she was accustomed to doing things. The Order taught agents to pass on their knowledge, so that the next one could do the same if the first were to die. Raven passed on her knowledge to the sole by-librarian she hadn't managed to kill. The irony didn't escape anyone. During their evening breaks, they talked. Not much. Hagen was quiet by nature. Raven spoke little and to the point. Dan asked questions, but not about the Order, about themselves. On the 5th evening, he asked Hagen about her clan. Hagen was silent for a long time. Then she told him. The Northern Park clan. Hunters. 10 families. They lived in the mountains. They hunted beasts for a bounty from the nearest town. 3 years ago, the Nameless Ones appeared. The clan didn't know how to fight them. 4 of the best hunters died within 6 months. The clan fell apart. The families scattered. Hagen was left alone. Her partner, a man named Taro. He died right before her eyes. The Nameless One devoured him. Hagen fired. The arrows passed right through. She couldn't do anything. She just stood there and watched as her partner was devoured by a nameless creature. Since then, she had been heading south, searching. She didn't know for what exactly. She just kept walking, until she stopped at a tavern and heard a knock on the door. Dan listened. Then he said, "I'll find his name. The Nameless One who killed Taro." Hagen looked at him. Something flashed in her dark eyes. Tears. For a split second. Then they vanished. She nodded and said nothing. On the 7th day, they descended from the pass. The landscape had changed. The cliffs gave way to hills. The hills were covered in forest. The forest was old. The trees were thick. The canopies dense.
The sun didn't reach the ground. Raven said they were close. She could feel it. Not magic, experience. The air smelled different. The ground was different, as if something big lay beneath the soil. On the 8th day, they found a road. Not a trail, a road. Stone slabs laid flat, overgrown with moss, cracked, but even. The road led east. Mercy had calculated the route precisely. The road matched her map right down to the last turn. Dan walked on stones that were 1,000 years old. The stones were smooth, polished by millions of footsteps. Librarians had walked here. 1,000 years ago, people with gray marks on their wrists walked this road. They were heading to the archive, carrying scrolls, returning with knowledge. And then the road was flooded with blood and buried with earth. And it had waited 1,000 years. Raven discovered 6 more traps along the road. The last one was more complex than the previous ones. Magical. A rune carved into the stone. A paralyzing spell is activated upon approach. Raven said that agents of the Middle Circle set these. So someone from the Order had been here relatively recently, 10 or 15 years ago, checking, updating the defenses. The Order knew where the archive was, knew and guarded it, not to use it, so that no one else would use it. On the 9th day, the road ended. It ran into a wall, a stone wall 4 men high, smooth, seamless, no doors, no windows. The wall stretched off in both directions and disappeared into the forest. Dan stood in front of it and looked. The resonator hung around his neck. The mark on his wrist pulsed, stronger than ever. It didn't hurt. It was persistent, like a heartbeat. He walked up to the wall and placed his palm on the stone. Warm. The stone was warm, as if alive. Symbols appeared on the surface, faint, barely visible. Dan read them. They appeared beneath his fingers like ink on heated paper. The symbols formed words. The words formed a phrase. Dan read it. Name yourself. Not a name, not a rank, not a class. Name what you are. Dan stood before the wall and thought. Hejin stood 10 paces away and waited. Raven stood behind a boulder and watched the forest. Silence. The forest was silent. The wind had died down. Even the birds had fallen silent. Name what you are. Not a name, not Dan Hale, not a class, not a librarian. What he is. He closed his eyes, opened the inner library, saw shelves, hundreds of shelves, thousands of books and scrolls, earthly and local, scientific and ancient. Every page he had read in its place, every document in its category, every piece of knowledge accessible and systematized, he understood. He opened his eyes. He raised the resonator to his lips and uttered 2 words in the language of the ancients. Keeper of names. The resonator hummed. The sound faded into the wall. The stone vibrated beneath his palm. Symbols flared up, all at once, with a bright silver light. A crack ran across the wall. Not destructive. Straight, vertical, right down the center. The wall split apart, slowly, with a rumble that could be felt in his bones. Beyond the wall was darkness. Then light came from the darkness, dim, silvery, coming from within. Dan stood in the opening and looked inside. A hall, a huge hall. The ceiling was lost in the twilight, and along the walls, from floor to ceiling, shelves. Thousands of shelves. Tens of thousands of scrolls, codices, tablets, books. A whole world of knowledge sealed away 1,000 years ago and waiting for the one who would call himself by the right name. Dan Hale stood on the threshold of the first sealed archive. A graduate student from Boston, an orphan from the temple, the keeper of names. He sat down on the stone floor by the wook, and he cried. Dan didn't cry for long, a minute, maybe 2. Then he wiped his face with his sleeve and stood up. Hejin stood at the entrance and looked at the shelves with an expression Dan had never seen on her face before. Not emptiness, not calm, confusion. She was used to forests and cliffs, to creatures and battle. She didn't know what to do with a room full of scrolls. Raven entered last. She scanned the walls, the ceiling, the corners. She checked for traps inside, found none. The archive was clean. Whoever had sealed it hadn't set any traps inside. The traps were outside. The Order had added their own. But whoever had created the archive wanted those who entered to feel safe. Dan walked over to the nearest shelf. He reached out. He touched a scroll. The leather of the tube was dry and smooth. No mold, no dust. 1,000 years and the scrolls looked like new. Preservation magic. Or something more complex.
He pulled out a scroll, unrolled it. The text was in the language of the ancients. Dan read it as if it were English. A treatise on the classification of living beings by type of magical core. 200 pages, complete, undamaged. He put the scroll back and took the next one.
A history of the continent's trade routes before the burning. Next. A medical reference. Next. A technical drawing. Next. A bestiary. Dan stopped. A bestiary. Complete. Not a fragment. Not a fragment. A complete catalog of creatures written 300 years before the burning. 412 species. 412 true names. With descriptions, with weaknesses, with precise instructions for destruction. Dan held the scroll in his hands and felt its weight, not physical. This scroll was worth more than an army, more than 10 armies. With it, he could kill every nameless one on the continent. He began to read. The memory core was working at full capacity. Every page imprinted itself on his mind like a fingerprint. Names, descriptions, weaknesses. He read quickly. Page after page, scroll after scroll. Hale brought him water from the stream outside. He drank without looking up from his reading. Raven lit a fire at the entrance. She prepared a meal from their supplies. Dan ate with one hand while turning the pages with the other. He read all day the first day, all night, all day the second day. On the third day, Hale approached and silently took the scroll from his hands. Dan looked up. His eyes ached. His fingers wouldn't bend. His back wouldn't straighten. Hale said one word. Sleep. Dan wanted to object. Then he realized he couldn't focus his eyes. He lay down on the stone floor. He fell asleep instantly. He woke up 10 hours later. Raven was sitting by the entrance. Hale was sleeping, curled up against the wall. Dan sat up and took stock. In 3 days, he had read and memorized the contents of 32 shelves, roughly a fifth of the archive. He had mastered the bestiary completely. 412 names lay in his head like bullets in a magazine. In addition to the bestiary, he had read 7 medical treatises that expanded the Ivonne pharmacopoeia 20-fold. 3 engineering codices, 2 treatises on agronomy, 1 on metallurgy that Bran would appreciate, and 1 document that changed everything. He found it on the 27th shelf, not a scroll, a codex, a thick one, in a leather binding with embossing, an inscription on the cover, the Register of Keepers. Inside were names, hundreds of names, each accompanied by a description of rank and degree. Librarian of the 1st degree, reading of marks. Librarian of the 3rd degree, shelf of memory. Librarian of the 5th degree, binding. Librarian of the 7th degree, voice of the catalog. 13 degrees. Each subsequent rank included all the previous ones and added a new ability. Dan flipped through the pages. He was looking for the 13th. He found it. 1 entry, 1 name. 1,000 years ago. Librarian of the 13th rank, the master catalog. Ability. All the previous ones, +1. Transmission. A 13th degree bearer can transmit the knowledge of true names to other people, not as text, as an ability. He can teach them to pronounce the names. Not everyone, only those who are already librarians. But with this ability, 1 keeper of names can create 100. Dan closed the codex, placed it on his lap, sat, and breathed. He wasn't one of them. He was the one. The 13th, once in 1,000 years. An ability that changes everything. Not because he was the strongest, but because he could pass the power on to others. He remembered his goal. Not a throne, not power. A library in every city, a catalog in every guild, 100 students who know the names. Now he knew it was possible. Not a dream, a plan. On the 5th day in the archives, Dan found something else. In the far corner, behind the last bookshelf, a stone niche. In the niche stood a sarcophagus, small, made of white stone, an inscription on the lid. Arion, the last keeper of the 12th degree, who had waited 1,000 years. Dan stood before the sarcophagus and read the second inscription, a long one, carved in small letters on the side wall. Arion wrote in the first person. He described the last day before the burning, how an army of warriors and mages surrounded the librarians' capital, how they slaughtered everyone, how the shelves burned, how Arion fled, how he made it to the first archive, sealed it, and stayed inside. Not because he couldn't get out, because he knew he had to wait.
Wait for the 13th. He waited 1,000 years. The archive's magic sustained his life. His body aged slowly, but not forever. When he realized he was dying, he reached out. Not into this world, to another. He searched. He searched for a soul with the right pattern, with the right mindset. He found a graduate student in Boston who was dying at that very moment, who had spent his life in libraries, who loved order and knowledge, who did not want power. He wanted to help. Arian pulled his consciousness through the space between worlds, placed it into the body of a local orphan, and died.
Dan stood and read. His eyes were dry. He read it all, to the very last letter. Then he placed his palm on the lid of the sarcophagus and whispered, "Thank you." The stone was warm, then it slowly grew cold, and Dan felt that something had gone, something that had been held within the walls of the archive for 1,000 years. A presence, an expectation. It was over. The keeper had waited. On the 6th day they left. Dan carried the bestiary and the register of keepers with him. 2 scrolls, the 2 most important documents in the world. The rest remained in the archive. He sealed the door behind him, with the same word, Keeper of Names. The wall closed. Dan looked at it and said, "I'll be back," with the students. They walked back faster. They knew the way. The traps had been neutralized. They crossed the pass in 3 days instead of 4. On the 8th day of their journey, they saw the road. On the 9th day, they saw the station. It stood intact. Smoke from the chimney. Sora came out to meet them. The return to the station was not peaceful. Sora met them at the door and immediately delivered 3 pieces of news. First, while Dan was away, 42 people had come to the station for help. Sora and Ivonne had handled them all. Second, Bran had finished the 3rd resonator, an improved version, lighter, cleaner sound. Third, a messenger had arrived from the capital with an official letter, sealed by the House of Vance, the royal house. The letter was addressed to Dan Hale, the librarian. Dan took the letter, unfolded it, read it. The text was in official imperial, formal, polite. Behind every word lay steel. The great House of Vance invited the librarian to the capital for an audience. It did not ask, it invited. But an invitation from the royal house is an order wrapped in silk. Dan placed the letter on the table and looked at Mercy. Mercy turned pale. She knew what an invitation from the great house meant. It meant that Dan was known up there. Not rumors, not whispers at the market. Knowledge, concrete, with a name and address. Dan asked Raven, "Is the order connected to the House of Vance?" Raven replied, "Not directly. The order operates autonomously. But among the Vance House advisors, there are people who sympathize with the order. And vice versa. The lines are blurred." Dan nodded. He wouldn't go to the capital. Not now. Not on the great house's terms. He wrote a reply. Polite, formal. He thanked them for the invitation. He explained that he was busy with important work on the road. He offered an alternative. If the House of Vance needed his services, they should send a description of the problem. He would help from a distance. The messenger left with the reply. Dan knew that this would buy him a week, maybe 2, no more. The great houses weren't used to refusals, but he didn't have weeks. He had 20 days until the arrival of the Order's combat group, according to Raven's calculations. He gathered everyone: Sora, Ivonne, Hagen, Mercy, Raven. Bran had come from the city. 7 people in a room on the ground floor of the station. Dan spread a map out on the table. Next to it, the bestiary. Next to that, the register of keepers. He told them everything. About the archive, about the 412 names, about the 13 degrees, about Arion, about his ability to pass on the knowledge of the names to other librarians. When he finished, there was silence. Then Ivonne spoke up. "And how do you plan to find the other librarians if they're being killed in their cradles?" Dan replied. "Not all of them," Raven said. 40 out of 42 in 10 years, 2 survived. Somewhere on the continent there are 2 more librarians, maybe more. Those the Order didn't find, those who went into hiding, those who received their class and told no one. Mercy raised her hand. She said, "She can find them." The Catalogers Guild has a registry of everyone who has undergone the ritual over the past 20 years. Everyone's class is recorded. If Mercy gains access to the registry, she'll find every living librarian. Dan looked at her. He asked. "It's dangerous," Mercy replied. "Very. If the guild finds out why she needs the registry, they'll execute her for heresy."
Dan said. Then don't. Mercy took off her glasses, wiped the lenses, put them back on. She said, I'll go tomorrow. Dan wanted to object. Mercy looked at him and said, My cards, my name, my decisions. You taught me that yourself. Dan shut his mouth. He nodded. Ivonne snorted. The next 5 days were spent preparing. Mercy left for the capital, alone, with a forged order that Dan had drafted based on forms from the temple archives. The forgery was perfect. Dan knew what every official seal from every department looked like because he'd seen samples of them in the scrolls. Bran had carved a copy of the seal from a copper plate.
Mercy took with her a document that looked like a senior inspector's order for a routine audit of the registries. While Mercy was in the capital, Dan was preparing the station for defense. Not military. Information. He understood that a combat team of 6 mid-tier agents was serious business. Heijin could handle 2, maybe 3. Raven knew their tactics and could neutralize another 1 or 2. But 6 was too many. Dan didn't want to fight. A fight meant bodies. Bodies meant an investigation. An investigation meant attention. He needed another solution. He found it in the bestiary. Not in the creatures section, in the appendix. The ancient librarians used a defense system based not on force, but on information. A network of markers across the territory. Each marker contained a fragment of a true name. Not the whole name, a fragment, safe on its own. But when an intruder crossed the perimeter, the markers activated sequentially and created a sound field, a low hum. Not lethal. Disorienting. A person inside the field lost their sense of direction, couldn't find the way out, spun in place until they were exhausted. Dan could create such a field. He needed to pronounce the fragments of the names and inscribe them on stone tablets. The resonator allowed him to do this without harming his throat. The fragments were short, 2 or 3 syllables, not full names. His throat could handle it. He worked for 3 days. He carved 24 tablets, 2 syllables on each. Hagen and Raven placed them around the perimeter of the station, a circle 300 meters in diameter. Dan activated the system by saying the keyword through the resonator. The tablets hummed, quietly, barely audible, but Dan could feel the field, like a taut spiderweb. Anyone who crossed the perimeter with hostile intentions would fall into a trap of sound and lose their bearings. The system wasn't perfect. It didn't distinguish friends from enemies based on intent. It distinguished them by tags. Dan made 5 medallions, 1 for each team member. The medallion contained a counterfragment that neutralized the field for the wearer. Bran received his, Sora received hers. Ivonne received hers. Hagen and Raven received theirs. On the 12th day after returning from the archive, Mercy returned to the station. She was pale, thin, dark circles under her eyes. But in her hands she held a scroll, thick, long, a register. Every librarian who had undergone the ritual in the past 20 years. Names, location at the time of the ritual, status. Mercy spread the register out on the table. Dan began to read. 44 names in 20 years. Next to 40 of them was a note. Deceased, date, cause, accident, bandit attack, illness, fire. Dan read the causes and saw the order behind every line. 4 were alive. 4. Not 2 as he had thought. 1 woman, 26 years old, in a mountain village in the north. 1 man, 30 years old, in a port city in the west. A 17-year-old teenager in a monastery in the south. And a 14-year-old girl in the capital. 14 years old. She hadn't undergone the ritual yet. But there was a note in the registry. Preliminary diagnosis, probable class, librarian. Dan stared at that name. A 14-year-old girl in the capital. The capital where the order is based. The capital where the Vances live. The capital from which the invitation had come. She was in the most dangerous place on the continent, and she didn't know it. Dan looked up at Raven. He asked, "Does the order know about her?" Raven replied, "If the preliminary diagnosis made it into the guild registry, then yes. The order has informants in the guild. They know." Dan closed his eyes. The time he already didn't have was running out even faster. The order's combat unit would arrive in 8 days. A 14-year-old girl in the capital. 4 living librarians on the continent. Every one of them in danger. He opened his eyes. He said, "We're changing the plan." The new plan was risky. Dan split up the team. Hajin and Raven were heading to the capital. The objective? Find the girl. Pick her up. Bring her to the station. Quietly. Without a fight. Without drawing attention. Raven knew the capital. She knew the order's routes. She knew how to move unnoticed.
Heijin was backup in case they couldn't pull it off quietly. Sora stayed at the station. Ivonne stayed. Mercy stayed. Bran stayed. The force field was active. If the combat unit arrived earlier than expected, the field would hold them back. It wouldn't stop them. It would delay them. That should be enough for Sora and the others to make it out via the alternate route that Heijin had laid through the forest to the caves, a 2-hour journey. Dan stayed at the station. His body wouldn't have been able to handle the pace of an operation in the capital. He knew it. He accepted it. He hated it. But he accepted it.
Heijin and Raven set out at dawn. Dan stood in the doorway and watched as the two figures disappeared onto the road. One tall, with a bow on her back, the other in a black cloak with 2 blades. He turned and went to work. He had 4 days while they were on their way, and 4 days while they were returning. 8 days. He used every hour. He spent the first 2 days compiling what he called the manual. Not a scroll, not a codex, a system. A step-by-step guide for future librarians. How to activate mark reading. How to develop the memory shelf. How the binding works. How to pronounce true names through the resonator. What the limitations are. What the risks are. What the cost is. Everything he had learned in 3 months of personal experience. Everything he had read in the Keeper's Registry. Systematized, cataloged, clear. He wrote for people who had never attended university. For people who had been called the trash class their whole lives. For people who didn't believe their abilities were abilities. He wrote for Sora, for Mercy, for a 14-year-old girl whose name he didn't yet know. On the 3rd day, he set aside the textbook and took up another. A medical reference book. For Sora. Complete. Based on 7 treatises from the archive, supplemented with earth medicine. 300 pages. Dan transcribed from morning until night. Sora sat beside him and read the finished pages. She asked questions. Dan answered without looking up from his writing. By the evening of the 4th day, the handbook was ready. Dan bound it himself. Bran made the copper clasps. Ivonne treated the cover with a moisture-repellent solution. On the spine, Dan wrote, Field Doctor's Handbook, compiled by Sora Minso. Sora took the handbook. She read her name on the spine. She pressed the book to her chest. She stood there for a minute. Then she said quietly, "Thank you," and she went to the infirmary. Dan returned to work. On the 5th day, he made a wooden box for Ivonne. Bran carved out the dividers, 24 compartments, each one labeled. The name of the herb, its properties, dosage, compatibility with other herbs. Ivonne opened the box. She looked at the labels. She closed it. She opened it again. She said, "You're a completely unbearable person." Then she hugged the box and went to the lab. On the 6th day, for Mercy, he put her first signed card in a wooden frame. That very one, with her name in the corner. Mercy hung the frame on the basement wall next to the shelves. Then she stood there looking at it. Then she adjusted it. Then she walked away. Then she came back and adjusted it again. Dan wasn't watching. He was preparing something else. For Raven, a list. A short one. 6 names. He'd compiled it from the orders reports that Raven had relayed to him from memory. 6 people Raven had saved. Not killed. Saved. By accident. Indirectly. Once she'd warned a village of a raid a day before the attack. Officially, it was intelligence for the order. But the village had managed to evacuate. 130 people survived, because Raven arrived a day earlier than she was supposed to. Another time, she killed the Nameless One, who was heading toward the settlement. Officially, she was training, but the settlement survived. 6 instances. 6 moments when Raven's song did not do what she was ordered to do. 6 times when the weapon refused to be a weapon. She didn't remember these moments as significant. Dan remembered them for her. On the 7th day, Heijin and Raven returned, not alone. A girl was with them, small, skinny, black hair down to her shoulders, large gray eyes, a barely noticeable gray shadow on her right wrist. A preliminary mark. Her class hadn't fully manifested yet. She was 14. Her name was Lena Torn. Raven gave a brief account. The girl lived in an orphanage attached to the Temple of the Catalogers. An orphan, like Dan. When they came for her, the order was already nearby. 2 agents from the outer circle were watching the orphanage. Raven neutralized both of them. Quietly, no deaths. She tied them up and left them in the basement. Heijin carried the girl out through the roof. Lena stood in the middle of the room and looked around. She didn't understand what was happening. She didn't understand why they had taken her.
She didn't understand why everyone was looking at her. Dan approached. He crouched down in front of her to be at eye level. He said, "Your name is Lena. You are a librarian. It's not an insult. It's the most important class in the world. And I'll explain everything to you." Lena looked at him, then at the gray mark on his wrist, just like her shadow on her skin. She said, "At the orphanage, they told me that being a librarian is a disgrace, that it would have been better if she'd been born without a class." Dan replied, "They were wrong." Lena didn't believe him.
It's okay, that's normal. Dan didn't believe it right away either. He took her to the basement and showed her the shelves. He showed her the catalog. He showed her how to read the scrolls. Lena watched. Then she reached out and touched a scroll. She unrolled it. She looked at the text. She said, "I can read this." Dan nodded. "It's mark reading, first level. You already have it." Lena read the scroll, slowly, syllable by syllable. But she was reading text in a language she didn't know. Her eyes grew wide. She lifted her head and looked at Dan, and for the first time all day, she smiled. On the 8th day, exactly as Raven had calculated, the protective field activated. 6 people crossed the perimeter at dawn. Dan sensed it. The signs began to hum. The vibration traveled through the station's walls. He got up, got dressed, hung the resonator around his neck, stepped out onto the porch. Hajin was already on the roof, bow drawn. Raven had vanished into the shadows. Sora led Lena and Mercy to the emergency exit. Yvonne stood by the lab window with 3 test tubes in her hands, an incendiary mixture, her own invention. Dan stood on the porch and waited. An hour passed, 2, 3. No one appeared. The field was working. 6 agents were circling 300 meters from the station. They couldn't find their way. Every time they got close, the field turned them around. They were heading toward the station but ended up on the highway, again and again. At 4 o'clock, one of them screamed. Dan heard the scream, angry, confused. At 5 o'clock, 2 of them sat down on the ground, exhausted. At 6 o'clock, they left. Dan felt the field calm down. The vibrations subsided. The signs fell silent. The 6 left the perimeter and headed west, toward the highway, away from the station. Hagen came down from the roof. She said, "They're gone, all 6 of them." Dan nodded, but he knew they'd be back. With reinforcements, with mages capable of neutralizing the field, with people from the inner circle. And next time, Haywood Kane himself would be standing behind them. After the combat group's retreat, Dan called a council, at night, by candlelight. Everyone sat in the large room. Lena was sleeping upstairs. Mercy stayed with her. The rest looked at Dan. He said, "We can't stay here. The station is home. But it's a home the enemy knows." He proposed a plan, not flight, expansion. 1 station is a single point that can be destroyed. 10 stations are a network that cannot be destroyed. He needed to create a network, quickly, in a month. Library points in every town along the route. Not full libraries, small ones. 1 or 2 bookshelves. Copies of key medical and household scrolls. A local keeper. Communication between points via couriers. If one is destroyed, the knowledge will be preserved in the others. Yvonne asked who would be the custodians. "They don't have people," Dan replied. "There are people." Over the past 3 months, more than 100 people have passed through the station. Farmers, artisans, monks, healers. Among them are those who can read, those who can be trusted with a bookshelf. They won't know they're part of a network. They'll think they're just storing useful scrolls. But together, they'll create a catalog. "The first in 1,000 years, Hagen said. "That won't protect us from the Order." "The Order will come here," Dan replied. "Let them come, but not to us. The station will remain as a decoy, empty, with a minimum of scrolls. With an active, protective field. The Order will waste their strength on the assault. They'll find empty shelves, and we'll be somewhere else." Raven shook her head. She said, "Kane isn't stupid, he'll figure it out," Dan replied. "I know. That's why I need to meet with him before he gets here." Silence. Everyone looked at him. Dan explained, "Kane is hunting the librarians because he fears the return of the ancient order. He fears that the librarians will seize power again. That knowledge will once again become a tool of tyranny." And in some ways he's right. 1,000 years ago the librarians ruled. Not all of them were good. Not all of them were just. Some used true names for control, for subjugation, for power. The burning was monstrous, but the fear that spawned it was real. Dan said, "I don't want the old order to return. I don't want the librarians to rule the world. I want knowledge to be shared. I want true names to be known not by 1 person, but by 100.
I want the library to be a home, not a weapon. If I explain this to Cain, there's a chance he'll stop, Raven said. No. Cain won't stop. He's killed too many. If he stops, it means everything he's done was in vain. He can't accept that, Dan replied. Maybe, but I have to try. The next 3 weeks were the most intense of Dan's life, in both lives. He was doing 4 things at once. First, he was building a network.
Mercy calculated the routes. 9 points along the road within a week's journey. Dan personally rode to each one. His body protested. The horse hated him, and he hated the horse. But he rode. In every town he found a person, a doctor, a knowledgeable farmer, a merchant with a clean cellar. He left copies of the scrolls. He explained how to store them, how to use them. He didn't mention the network. He said it was a gift from the station. Useful recipes, medical reference books, agronomic tables. People accepted them with gratitude. Second, he taught Lena. 2 hours every morning. Reading the marks was already working. The shelf of memory was beginning to manifest. The girl was memorizing what she read better with each passing day. Not as precisely as Dan, but better than an ordinary person. He didn't rush her. He let her read what she wanted. Not the bestiary, not military treatises, fairy tales, stories, travelers' diaries. Lena read, and for the first time in her life, smiled every day. Third, he prepared gifts for the final meeting. For every member of the team, personal, thoughtful, things that told each of them what Dan couldn't always put into words. For Hagen, he found a drawing of an ancient arrowhead in the bestiary, of a special design, capable of piercing magical defenses. Bran forged it from the drawing, black steel, perfect form. Hagen took the tip, turned it over in her hands, squinted, attached it to an arrow. She shot it at a tree 100 meters away. The arrow passed through the trunk and flew on. Hagen looked at Dan. He looked back. It was the first time she had smiled in his presence. Not for long, just a second. But he saw it. For Raven, he wrote a list, those very 6 names, the people she had saved. Raven read the list. Dan watched. She read in silence. She reached the end. Went back to the beginning, read it again. Then she folded the paper, tucked it into her bosom. Looked at Dan. Her eyes were wet. She said nothing. She left. Hagen found her an hour later on the roof. Raven was sitting there, looking at the stars. The list lay on her lap. The 4th. Dan wrote a letter. To Lord Inquisitor Haywood Cain, head of the Order of the Pure Register. He wrote it over 3 nights, tore it up, rewrote it, tore it up again. The final version was short, 10 lines. He wrote, I know who you are. I know what your order does. I know why. And I understand why. I don't want war. I don't want power. I don't want a repeat of the past. I want a conversation, just one, at a table, with tea, without weapons. I'll be at the station in 12 days, alone. Come, or don't come. The choice is yours. Dan Hale, Librarian. He gave the letter to Raven. She knew how to deliver it, a dead drop on the road. The order checked it once a week. The letter will arrive. 5 days after the letter is sent, late evening, rain. Everyone was sitting in the large room. Some were repairing gear, some were reading, some were sewing. On the table in front of each person lay a gift. Sora's handbook, Yvonne's box, Hagen's spearhead, Isla's notebook, which Dan had prepared but not yet given, Mercy's map in a frame on the wall, Raven's list tucked under the arm of the woman sleeping on the roof. Dan sat in the corner. He was mending the spine of a scroll, delicate work, needle and thread. His fingers were used to it. 3 months ago, he couldn't hold a needle without trembling. Now he could. Lena lay on the floor next to Mercy and read a fairy tale by candlelight. Bran sharpened a knife. Yvonne sorted through herbs in her box. Sora was copying out a recipe. Hagen sat by the window, watching the rain. Raven was sleeping. For the first time, not on the roof. In the room, next to the others. Isla looked up and said quietly, "But a year ago, there wouldn't have been any of us here. None of us." Dan looked at her, then at the others. A room full of people who had found each other. A room full of people the world had deemed unnecessary. A heretical herbalist, a healer no one listened to, a hunter weapon, a defector assassin, a cartographer whose name had been erased, a runaway princess, a girl who was told she was a disgrace,
A blacksmith who forged for those who were despised. A boy from Boston who died on a night road and woke up in a world where his class was considered trash. It grew quiet, so quiet you could hear the rain. Haywood Kane arrived on the 12th day, at exactly noon, alone, just as Dan had asked. Dan stood on the station's porch and watched a man walk down the road. Tall, upright, gray hair, an immaculate gray cassock without a single wrinkle. His hands were folded in front of him, his stride was measured, calm, like that of a man who knows that every step he takes is worth someone's life, and has long since stopped counting. He walked through the protective field, as if through empty air. Dan felt it. The alarms didn't go off, the field didn't react. Kane was carrying something that neutralized the defense, an artifact, or knowledge, or both. Kane stopped 10 paces from the porch. He looked at Dan, for a long time, appraisingly. Then he said he'd expected someone older. Dan replied that everyone says that. Kane smiled, gently, like a teacher to a favorite student, and that smile sent a chill down Dan's spine. He invited Kane inside. A table, 2 chairs, a teapot, 2 cups. Dan brewed the tea himself following Ivonne's recipe. Herbal, mild, no bitterness. He knew Kane would test the tea before drinking it. And Kane did. He pulled a thin silver rod from his sleeve, dropped it into the cup, waited 3 seconds. The stick didn't change color. Clean. Kane removed the stick and took a sip. He said, "Good tea." Dan sat across from him. Between them was a table, 2 scrolls, a teapot. 2 people on opposite sides of a 1,000-year-old conflict. Kane spoke first. He spoke softly, calmly, without a threat. He said he'd read the reports about Dan, about Ashton, about the station, about the network, about the girl who'd been taken from the capital. He knows everything. He's been watching from the very beginning, ever since the first rumor reached the capital. He said he was impressed. In 3 months, Dan had done more than any librarian in the last 500 years. He had created a network, created a catalog, found the archive, learned the names, learned to use the resonator, found a student. And that was exactly what the Order had feared for 1,000 years. Dan listened, drank tea, didn't interrupt. Kane continued. He told the story of the burning, not the version Dan had read in the archive, another one, the Order's version. Before the burning, the librarians ruled the Axis colonnade absolutely. They held all the names, all the knowledge, all the recipes. Nothing happened without their permission. You couldn't heal a child without a librarian's permission. You couldn't build a house. You couldn't hunt a beast. Knowledge was power, and the librarians clenched it in their fist. When the warriors and mages rebelled, it wasn't out of envy, it was out of desperation. People were dying because the librarian in their city didn't deem it necessary to share a formula. Children were dying from diseases the librarians could cure but wouldn't. Because knowledge is expensive, because every prescription is power, because whoever gives away knowledge for free loses control, Kane said. The burning was terrible. He doesn't deny it, but it was necessary. And his family has been making sure ever since that knowledge never again becomes a weapon of a single class. Dan listened and thought. Kane was smart. Kane believed what he was saying. It wasn't a lie. It was the truth. Partial, one-sided, but the truth. The librarians had indeed abused their power. The Keeper's registry confirmed it. Among the records were mentions of keepers who sold names for gold, who refused to help poor cities, who used the voice of the catalog to subjugate. Dan finished his tea, set down the cup, said, "You're right." Kane blinked. He hadn't expected that. Dan continued. The librarians abuse their power. Knowledge in the hands of a single class is tyranny, no matter how good that class is. Sooner or later, someone will decide they know better than everyone else. Kane nodded, slowly. "Careful," Dan said. "That's why I don't do what they did. I don't keep knowledge to myself, I share it." He placed 2 scrolls on the table, unrolled the first. A textbook for librarians. Abilities, methods, limitations, all in plain text. Anyone can read it. Anyone can learn. He unfolded the second. A network map. 9 points, each containing copies of the medical and household scrolls. Accessible, free, for everyone, Dan said. "I'm not building a new monopoly. I'm destroying the very idea of a monopoly on knowledge. In a year, every city will have a library. In 2 years, 10 people will know the true names of 10 people. In 5 years, 50. In 10, 100. Not a single keeper. 100. If one is killed, 99 will remain. If one library is burned, 20 more will remain. Knowledge will cease to be the weapon of a single man. It will become the air that everyone breathes. Cain listened. His face didn't change, but Dan saw his hands. His fingers were gripping the cup a little tighter than necessary. Cain thought. Then he said, "Beautiful, but naive. People are greedy. Sooner or later, one of the students will decide that knowing more than the others is an advantage, and then the cycle will repeat itself." Dan replied, "Maybe, but as long as knowledge is in the hands of one person, it can be destroyed with a single blow. When knowledge is held by 100, by 1,000, by 10,000, it cannot be destroyed, and it cannot be monopolized, because there will always be someone who will share it, just as I am sharing now." Cain was silent. For a long time, the tea grew cold. Silence hung in the room like a third person. Then Cain said, "You understand that I can't let you go?" Dan replied, "I understand," Cain said. "If I let you go, then everything I've done for 30 years, all the deaths, all the burned scrolls, all the librarians killed, all of it becomes in vain. I can't live with that." Dan looked him in the eye. He said, "It was already in vain. Cain, you killed people whose only crime was that they knew how to read. You burned knowledge that saved lives. You destroyed 40 people in 10 years. Children, old people, women, people who never wanted power, who simply read. You don't need my permission to stop. You need to look in the mirror." Cain didn't move. His eyes were dry. His hands had stopped trembling. He set down his cup, stood up, walked to the window, stood there and looked outside. Dan waited. He knew that the next few seconds would decide everything. Cain stood by the window and looked out at the station's courtyard. Lena was sitting on the porch, reading a scroll. Next to her, Mercy was adjusting her glasses and explaining something while pointing at the text. By the stables, Brand was sharpening a blade. Sora was hanging laundry on a line. Yvonne was yelling at someone in the lab. Hagen stood on the roof, motionless, bow in her hands. An arrow with a black tip knocked on the string. Raven stood behind the door of the room. Dan knew. 2 blades were drawn. Cain knew it too. He looked at Hagen's bow, at the door behind which Raven stood, at Dan. He said, "You're not alone." Dan replied, "No, not alone. And I never will be again, and neither will they. And your victims wouldn't have been alone either if you'd let them live." Cain closed his eyes. He stood like that for 10 seconds, 20, 30, then he opened them. Something had changed in his eyes. Not softness, not remorse. Weariness. Ancient. Heavy. The weariness of a man who had carried a burden for 30 years and only now realized he had been carrying a stone, not a banner. He said, "I won't stop the order. It's not in my power. Even if I leave, they will continue. Another leader, another inquisitor. The structure is too old, 1,000 years of inertia. One conversation over tea won't be enough," Dan replied. "I know." Cain looked at him. He said, "But I can buy you some time." Dan waited. Cain said, "A year." He could delay the next operation against Dan for a year. Report to the order that the librarian is weak and poses no threat. That the situation is under control. That there's no need to rush. A year. 12 months. During that year, Dan could build a network, teach students, spread knowledge. If, in a year, enough people possess that knowledge, the order won't be able to destroy it. There won't be enough agents. There won't be enough fire. If not, Cain shrugged, then he'll return. Dan stood up. He held out his hand. Cain looked at it. At the thin, boyish palm with a gray mark on his wrist. He didn't shake it, but he nodded, turned, went out, crossed the courtyard, walked past Lena, who looked up from her scroll and gazed at the gray-haired man in the gray cassock, walked past Bran, past Sora, went out onto the road, walked without looking back, until his figure from the horizon. Hagen lowered her bow. Raven sheathed her blades. Dan stepped out onto the porch and sat down on a step. A year. He'd been given a year. Not peace. Not victory. Time. The most precious resource. Sora came over and sat down beside him. She asked, "What next?" Dan looked at the road, at the empty road, at the sky that was beginning to turn pink at sunset. He said, "Next, we work." In the morning, he got up before everyone else. He went down to the basement, sat down at the table, unrolled a blank scroll, took a quill, and began to write the first letter.
To the 4 living librarians on the continent.
To a woman in a mountain village. To a man in a port city. To a teenager in a monastery. The same message to each. My name is Dan Hale. I am a librarian, just like you. You are not alone. You were never a trash class. You are the most important person on this continent, and I will teach you why. Come to the station. The map drawn by my friend Mercy will show you the way. The scrolls you'll receive with this letter were written by the herbalist Ivonne. The remedies described in them have been tested by the healer Sora. The path to the station is guarded by the hunter Hajin, and if you're scared, know that I was scared too. 3 months ago, I was lying on the stone floor of a temple, not knowing where I was. I didn't know why I was there. I knew only one thing. Shelves all around, scrolls on the shelves, dust on the scrolls, and not a single catalog. I started with the dust. You can too. He signed the letters. He put a copy of the first chapter of the textbook in each envelope. A copy of Mercy's map. A copy of Yvonne's 3 recipes. 4 envelopes. 4 future librarians. Dan Hale, a graduate student from Boston. An orphan from the temple. The 13th. The keeper of names. He sat in the basement by candlelight and sealed the envelopes. Upstairs, the station was waking up. Lena was asking Mercy how to spell the word catalog. Yvonne was scolding Bran for setting a hot teapot on her notes. Sora was boiling water for compresses. Hajin was standing on the roof, watching the sunrise. Raven was sleeping. For the first time in her life, it was quiet. Dan sealed the last envelope. He stood up. He climbed the stairs. He stepped out onto the porch. The morning was quiet. The road was empty. The sun was rising over the hills. Somewhere on the continent, 4 people with gray marks on their wrists were waking up, unaware that the world was about to change. Dan stood on the porch and watched the sun. Then he turned and went inside.